Hey, did you know that over 90% of our viewers watch our videos but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these true trucker horror stories, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. It's free and really motivates us to keep the stories rolling. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's stories.
Story number 1. The stretch of highway lay like a dark ribbon across the sleeping countryside, its lanes glistening faintly where the day's dampness had never quite burned away. Night had settled in fully hours before, and with it came the kind of quiet that made even the most familiar road feel like the last outpost of the world. Far ahead and far behind, no other headlights moved. The interstate belonged, for the moment, to a single tractor-trailer humming calmly east through the middle of nowhere. Inside the cab, Daniel Hale sat with his elbows relaxed on the steering wheel, fingers resting lightly at 10 and 2, as he had done on thousands of nights just like this. The cab was dim, the dash lights turned low, their green and amber glow a soft constellation of numbers and needles. The analog clock above his radio showed 2:13. The air smelled faintly of old coffee, diesel, and worn upholstery, a scent that had become, for him, synonymous with safety, routine, and the long, slow glide of the open road. Ahead, beyond the rounded nose of his truck, the highway vanished into a low, pale mist that clung to the ground and swirled in his high beams. It had been there for the last half hour, that fog, thin at first, just a suggestion of milkiness in the distance. But as the miles slipped beneath his tires, it had grown thicker, more insistent, until the world beyond the shoulder was swallowed entirely, leaving only two white lines, his headlights, and the patient hum of the engine. He'd driven in worse, dense coastal fog that had turned whole cities into ghost towns, mountain mist that drifted in sudden banks across hairpin turns. This, by comparison, felt tame. Still, there was something about it that held his attention, a quality he couldn't quite name. It didn't move like normal fog. It lay in even layers as if painted onto the air, the way a backdrop is painted behind a stage. It reacted to the wind from his passing truck, but only reluctantly, closing in again behind him as though the world was knitting itself up, erasing the road where he had been. The mile marker on the right shoulder slid into view, 139. The green sign was half veiled by mist, the white numbers glistening under a sheen of damp. Daniel let his eyes pass over it and then back to the road. He noted it without thinking. Mile 139. It meant he was making decent time. He took a sip from the travel mug in the cup holder. The coffee inside had cooled to the point where he could barely call it warm, but it was better than nothing. The liquid tasted slightly metallic, picking up the flavor of the stainless steel, but it was familiar, and familiar meant comfort. He swallowed, set the mug down, listened to it clink softly against the plastic of the holder, then leaned back, letting his shoulder blades settle deeper into the shape of the seat. Outside, the fog thickened, his world shrinking further, his headlights carving only a tight tunnel of visibility. The edges of that tunnel were soft and vague, the white lane markings vanishing into blue-gray softness at the edges of his sight. Beyond that, he knew, there were fields and trees, drainage ditches, maybe the occasional farmhouse light. None of that existed for him now. Only the lane, only the truck, only the sleep-bent night. The CB radio mounted on the dash crackled once, sharply, then fell back into a low hiss of static. Daniel glanced at it, more on reflex than curiosity. He hadn't heard another driver on Channel 19 in at least an hour. The interstate at this hour could feel abandoned, as if some quiet, unspoken agreement had cleared everyone off the road but him. The hiss lingered, a constant, soft sound under the deeper drone of the engine. It was almost like the whisper of wind over an open bottle, constant and hollow. He reached one hand out and turned the volume knob a notch lower. The hiss shrank but did not vanish. He left it there. Silence, particularly in fog, could be its own kind of unnerving. The next sign emerged from the mist, a rectangular board announcing some small town that lay miles ahead, its name partially obscured by a smear of condensation. He barely registered it. He was watching the lane, the gentle curve of the road as it moved through the landscape he couldn't see, allowing his body to relax into that subtle sway. He drove on. The mile marker on the right shoulder slid into view, 139. Daniel blinked once, not entirely sure at first that he had read it correctly. The same green, the same white numerals. It was common enough for markers to skip, for old ones to be left up when new roads were cut. Sometimes a little stretch of highway would inherit the numbering from a previous route. It wasn't something he thought about often. He let his eyes sweep the side of the road more deliberately now. On the right, just past the mile marker, he noticed a small, broken reflector post, leaning away from the pavement at an awkward angle, its tiny square of reflective tape cracked like old glass. Beside it, half hidden by the fog, a scrubby tree stood alone in the ditch, its trunk twisted, branches reaching sideways as though the wind had frozen them in place years ago. He glanced at the clock, 2:18 a.m. The CB gave a little twitch of static, then subsided again, like someone clearing a distant, phantom throat. He drove another 10 minutes by the clock, the steady rhythm of white dashes sliding beneath his headlights. The fog was denser now, and denser still in quick, variable patches, swallowing the distance until nothing remained but the immediate patch of road ahead. His pupils were slightly dilated, eyes working a little harder to keep the lane centered. He could feel the familiar prickle of alertness along the back of his neck that came with poor visibility and late hours. The mile marker on the right shoulder slid into view, 139. This time he stared. The sign was closer, clearer in his beams, the same number, the exact same spot, the broken reflector bent in the same direction, the twisted tree, its silhouette unmistakable. For a moment he thought he might be recognizing them from before, that his mind was filling in blanks in the fog. But as his truck rolled by, the uncanny precision of the image settled over him like a second skin. He checked the clock again, 2:29 a.m. A faint, hollow feeling unfolded in his chest, like the opening of a small, hidden door. Time was passing. The odometer, when he flicked his gaze down to it, showed an appropriate number of miles since the last fuel stop. Everything about the cab was normal. The rhythmic thunk of the tires over invisible seams in the pavement, the gentle sway with the curves, the low, white noise of air rushing past the mirrors. Except once again the CB. It crackled, louder this time, a rising and falling wash of static that carried, for the briefest moment, the ghost of a tone, halfway between a word and an exhale. He reached forward, thumbed the squelch knob a little to the right. The sound snapped quieter, then steadied into something almost like breathing. He imagined, absurdly, that if he leaned closer, he might hear words in it. That was the thing about long nights and long roads. Minds looked for patterns, shapes in clouds, faces in bark, meaning in the random pops of static. He let his shoulders drop a fraction, forced his grip on the wheel to loosen, and exhaled through pursed lips, as though he could blow away the growing unease the way he might try to clear his windshield. He told himself he would watch more carefully. Fog did strange things with perception. Landmarks repeated in memory because the brain had nothing else to latch onto. He drove on. The next town sign appeared, the same shape, the same smudge of moisture, the same half-visible name. He realized with a slow chill that he recognized the particular pattern of streaks on its metal face. He had noticed them without quite noticing the first two times, the way one notices the weave of fabric or the fine crackle in old paint. The mile marker on the right shoulder slid into view, 139. Daniel's hand moved to the turn signal before the conscious thought had fully formed. The orange arrow on the dash began to blink, soft, steady, the ticking sound loud in the quiet cab. There was no one behind him, no one ahead. He eased the truck gently onto the shoulder, the rumble strips under his right tires producing a low, buzzing growl. He let the truck roll to a stop. The engine idled, a soft, constant vibration through the floor and up the steering column. The headlights cut into the fog, illuminating the reflective numbers on the mile marker until they glowed bright white. The air beyond his windshield might as well have been a wall, his beams flattening against it, unable to penetrate far. He put the truck in neutral, set the parking brake, and sat listening. Out here, away from traffic and towns, the world carried a particular silence. Even with the engine running, he could feel it pressing in at the edges of the sound, a vast, open stillness lying over the fields and between the distant trees. The fog absorbed what little noise there might have been, the rustle of wind through grass, the faint, far-off call of some nocturnal bird. It turned everything into a kind of hush. The CB whispered quietly, no louder than before, but now it felt more like a presence in the cab than a harmless piece of equipment. Tiny rises and falls in the static suggested shapes, almost sentences that dissolved the moment he tried to fix them into place. He could stay here, wait for the fog to lift, call dispatch and blame weather for any delay. But the thought of simply sitting, engine idling, lights boring into that thick, featureless gray, made a different kind of unease stir. He reached for the door handle. When the seal broke, cool, damp air flowed in, carrying the clean, earthy scent of wet ground and the faint metallic tang of the guardrail. The sound of the engine became more blunt, more open. He climbed carefully down, boots finding the familiar rungs of the steps, and stepped onto the gravel shoulder. The fog wrapped around him immediately, its chill sinking through his jacket, moistening his hair and eyelashes. The world was narrowed now to the small island of light from his own truck. Even that seemed to thin quickly with distance, swallowed by the pale, drifting murk. The mile marker stood a short walk ahead, its metal post beaded with droplets. He walked toward it, gravel crunching under his boots, the sound muffled as though he were stepping on thick carpet. Each footfall felt both loud and deadened at the same time. The fog altered the usual sense of space. Distance was impossible to judge. Objects emerged abruptly, too close or too far, never quite where he expected them. Up close, the marker was unremarkable. Green paint, white border, numbers printed in clean, regulation font. He reached out and laid his fingers against the cool metal. It felt solid, fixed, real. He became aware, abruptly, of another sound, a far-off rush, like traffic on a highway that should not be there. But this road this night had been empty. He listened harder, tilting his head. The sound shifted, almost becoming the rumble of a truck passing in the distance, then fading, pulling away, as if descending a long, invisible hill. He turned slowly, scanning the fog. No headlights, no glow, only his own beams spilling over the shoulder and strip of lane behind him, turning the nearest curls of mist into bright, shifting veils. For reasons he could not articulate, he found himself looking not down the road ahead but back, along the route he had traveled. Through the fine, moving gauze of fog he saw them, two small, red dots hanging in the distance, low and paired like eyes. They were taillights. They burned steadily, unwavering, at what had to be several hundred yards away. No white headlights preceded them. No overhead glow suggested another vehicle approaching. They were simply there, fixed points of red in a gray void. He felt the hair on his arms lift under his sleeves. The pattern of those lights, the distance between them, the slight unevenness where one lens was newer than the other, was intimately familiar. He had seen it in his mirrors countless times, whenever he checked his own trailer on dark roads. He knew, without knowing how he knew, that he was looking at the back end of a truck identical to his. The idea came and perched quietly at the edge of his thoughts, that he was looking at himself, moving away into a fog that had folded the road back on itself like a ribbon being doubled. The red dots flickered once, as if something had passed between them and his line of sight. Then they dimmed, blurred, and were gone, leaving only the blank, pale wall of mist. Daniel took a slow breath, tasted the cold moisture on his tongue, and backed away from the mile marker. His boot brushed against the broken reflector post. The twisted tree in the ditch loomed, dripping with beads of condensation, its branches like skeletal arms reaching out of a dream. He climbed back into the cab. The seat embraced him with its familiar worn foam. He shut the door, sealing the outside world away behind the dull thunk of weather-stripping meeting metal. The cab filled again with the low, steady sound of the engine and the faint, ceaseless whisper of the CB. He considered for a brief, irrational moment, turning the truck around right there, using the wide shoulder and the opposing lane. But the image of taillights in fog lingered. If the road could fold, who could say what direction meant? Forward, backward, it might all be the same. He released the parking brake, shifted into gear, and pulled slowly back onto the lane. The rumble strips thrummed under his tires one last time, then gave way to smooth asphalt. He drove on. The pattern repeated. The drift of fog, the faintly smudged town sign, the twisted tree, the green rectangle of the mile marker sliding into his lights, 139. The clock's minutes advanced with their usual indifference. His fuel gauge ticked down in small, believable increments. His GPS, mounted low on the dash, showed a tiny digital truck icon crawling east along a featureless line. But the distance reading, always so reliable, seemed to hesitate, flickering between numbers as though uncertain how much of this road to count. Time yawned around him, stretching and folding like soft cloth. Night trucking had a way of making hours feel both endless and fleeting. He was used to that. Yet here, in this fog, with the quiet persistence of mile 139, the sensation deepened into something stranger. He began to feel as though he were inside a long, gray corridor with doors at regular intervals, and someone unseen kept resetting him back to the same one, watching to see how long it would take him to notice. Once the CB hiss shifted into something more structured. His handle, Riverbend, surfaced in the static, more impression than sound, like a word half heard in a dream. It came and went so quickly that he couldn't be sure he hadn't imagined it, but it left his palms damp against the wheel. Hours, if they were hours, passed like this. The world beyond the shoulders remained hidden, denied to him. It might have been that the fog was an illusion, a clever curtain. It might have been that nothing existed beyond his beams at all. The truck, the road, the little island of light and sound in which he moved. Perhaps that was the entire world and everything else had dropped quietly away. Then, as simply as someone dimming a lamp, the fog began to thin. It didn't vanish all at once. It retreated in slow, reluctant layers, revealing first the faint hint of a tree line, then the suggestion of distant hills, then, at last, the dim, silver bow of a moon low on the horizon. The stars were still mostly hidden, the sky a dulled charcoal gray. But the tight tunnel of headlights relaxed, allowing his gaze to travel farther, to recall what open space looked like. He drove another mile, then another. The mile marker on the right shoulder slid into view, 140. The number hit him with a quiet, almost comical force of surprise. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The broken reflector was gone. The twisted tree in the ditch was a different tree entirely, straighter, fuller. The sign stood like all the others, ordinary and uninterested. The CB had gone still, save for the slightest underlying hush. The GPS distance counter caught up all at once, spinning rapidly like a clock whose battery had been shaken back to life, then steadied on a new, more plausible figure. Dawn was still some hours away, but on the eastern edge of the sky, a faint suggestion of paler gray hinted that it would come. It always did, no matter how long the night seemed to stretch. At the next truck stop, Daniel rolled off the interstate and into the long, neon-lit lot, his trailer hissing softly as he eased to a park between two sleeping rigs. Sodium lights buzzed overhead. A few insects, confused by the lingering chill, battered softly against the glass. Inside the diner, the coffee was fresher, and the laminated menus shone faintly under the fluorescent hum. Another driver sat 3 stools down, a broad-shouldered man with a cap pulled low, hands wrapped around a steaming mug. His eyes slid to Daniel as the bell over the door jingled. "Foggy out there tonight," the man asked, as if making polite conversation. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, around mile 139. The man's gaze sharpened slightly. You lose some time. The question was so precise that it startled a small, reluctant laugh from Daniel's chest. Maybe, he said. Feels like I should be further than I am. GPS went a little crazy for a bit. The man nodded slowly as though confirming something to himself. Happens, he said. That stretch gets long. Has for a while. My old man drove this route. Said the same. Said he followed his own taillights once. He didn't say it like a joke. Daniel watched the steam rise from his coffee, the way it curled and dissipated in the cool diner air. Somewhere in the lot outside, an engine turned over, then cut, the sound distant, muffled by glass in the early hour. The highway waited beyond the doors, quiet and patient, the fog out there perhaps regrouping somewhere else, across some other mile. The mystery of 139 remained just that, a small, private puzzle lodged in the long flow of miles and nights, a slip in the weave, a place where distance and time did something strange, then smoothed themselves out as though nothing at all had happened. He knew that, out there, drivers would keep moving through it, one by one, cocooned in their cabs, watching the numbers flick by, watching their clocks, listening to the static. Most would pass mile 139 without any sense of repetition, feeling nothing more than the familiar weight of fatigue and the low murmur of their own thoughts. Some, every now and then, would see the sign more than once. They might pull over, step into the damp, encroaching fog, hear the whisper of an impossible truck passing just out of sight. They might glimpse, for a heartbeat, a pair of taillights hanging in a world that did not quite line up. Then the fog would lift, the mile markers would advance, and the road would return to its usual, straightforward way. The experience would become a story told over late-night coffee, accompanied by small, knowing smiles and shrugs. Explanations would be suggested and dismissed in the same breath. The interstate, for its part, would hold its silence, stretching out under the slow sweep of the stars, carrying its secrets mile after mile into the soft, waiting dark. Story number 2. The mountain highway rose and fell through the night like a slow, dark tide, its curves tracing the hidden ribs of the range. On either side, the slopes fell away into unseen valleys, dense with trees and stone, and the faint memory of old riverbeds. The world beyond the guardrail might as well have been a charcoal drawing left in the rain, shapes suggested, never confirmed. Mara drove the grade in low gear, the engine of her rig a constant, patient growl under her feet. The big diesel had that soft, steady vibration that spoke of a well-tuned machine, not straining but working, shouldering the climb with the quiet confidence of something built for exactly this. She watched the tack needle hover just where she liked it, right below the point where the tone shifted from hum to strain. Inside the cab, the air was a familiar blend of warm dashboard plastic, old coffee, and the faint citrus of a forgotten air freshener. Her thermos sat in the cup holder, ring of condensation around its base. The dash lights were dimmed low enough that only the necessary numbers glowed, a few green digits, a sweep of red needles, the soft lit squares of her radio. Beyond the windshield, fog had settled over the pass in a way that was almost deliberate. It did not drift quickly or tear apart with wind. It lay in layers, a pale, luminous gray that thickened in the dips and gathered along the ridgeline, folding itself into the curves of the road. Her headlights pushed into it, turning it into something tangible, like illuminated smoke, curling and swirling in their beams. She had driven Cloudback Pass many times, both day and night. In clear weather it offered sweeping views of distant, forested slopes and narrow glimpses of rivers far below. Tonight, all of that was gone. The world ended just at the edge of the beam pattern, at the white lines that glowed briefly under her truck before being left behind in the dark. On the radio, a late-night station faded in and out. It was some small-town AM frequency, the kind that played old songs and farm reports, voices thin and distant as though speaking through time as much as through air. Now, some gentle instrumental tune held the space, mellow piano, a low, breathy flute, threading itself quietly through the cab like a kind of spell. The clock on the dash read 3:04 a.m. Mara shifted in her seat, rolling one shoulder then the other, feeling the familiar ache that came from hours behind the wheel. It was not unpleasant exactly, more like the body's quiet reminder of the work being done. She flexed her fingers on the steering wheel, one hand at the bottom, one resting lightly at the side, thumbs poised, ready to move with every small correction. A sign slid out of the fog on the right, reflective letters gleaming in her headlights. CLOUDBACK past summit 12 miles. Beneath it, a smaller sign, fog area, use extreme caution. The fog thickened as if responding to the text on the metal. The view ahead narrowed until the road became a gray tunnel lined with white and yellow, the world beyond those painted lines erasing itself completely. Her sense of speed became less about sight and more about feel. The vibration through the wheel, the rhythm of the seams in the pavement, the subtle sway of the trailer behind her. She clicked on her fog lights. They spread a wider, lower band of illumination, catching the damp sheen of the asphalt, the shiny black ribbon of road looking almost oily under her beams. Drops of moisture beaded on the wiper arms and along the tiny chips in the glass. The fog absorbed light hungrily, softening edges, rounding off shadows. Some miles back, a newer driver at the last truck stop had asked about this pass, his eyes betraying the restless curiosity of someone not yet dulled by repetition. "Any truth to the stories?" he'd said, his tone half joking. "Lantern man, ghost flagger, all that." The older drivers had smiled in that way that said both yes and no at once. Stories mattered on the road. They weren't exactly believed and they weren't exactly disbelieved. They sat in the mind like old warning signs, not always precise, but rarely useless. Now, moving alone through the pale throat of the mountain fog, Mara found herself thinking about that phrase, lantern man. It felt faintly ridiculous on her tongue, even silently. Yet she glanced at the shoulder, at the way the white posts marking the edge appeared and disappeared like teeth in the mist. The CB radio above her head gave a dry little pop, a breath of static, then another. She reached up and turned the volume knob slightly higher, more out of habit than expectation. The channel was quiet, only the soft hiss of empty air and the occasional faint electronic chirp from some far-off signal. Her rig climbed another curve, easing left. The road tilted subtly under her, the right side lifting, the left dipping. A guardrail loomed to her left, its metal catching just a trace of reflection, then slipping back into obscurity. Beyond that somewhere was a steep drop full of darkness and trees and the patient, ancient bones of the mountain. She eased off the throttle a touch more, letting her speed settle into the range her instincts trusted in conditions like this. Slow enough to stop if she needed to, fast enough not to become a rolling hazard. It was a careful balance, and long years of driving had honed it into something she didn't often need to think about consciously. Then she saw the light. At first it was nothing more than a faint, warm glow off to the right, just beyond the edge of her beams. It was the wrong color to be a road flare, too steady and golden, without that sharp, urgent flicker. It hung low, maybe chest height to a standing person, and it seemed to sway slightly, as if moved by a hand rather than wind. Her foot moved to the brake almost before the thought formed. A human presence on the shoulder this high up in a fog like this would not be unusual if there had been an accident or breakdown. She eased the pedal gently, feeling the weight of her rig lean forward, the engine note dipping. The glow moved closer. As she drew within the reach of her stronger beams, the light resolved into something more concrete. A lantern, old-fashioned and metal-framed, its glass sides glowing with a soft, amber flame. The lantern hung from the end of an arm, the arm attached to the dark outline of a figure standing just at the edge of the road. The figure wore a coat, long enough to blur where it ended, the folds dissolving into fog. A cap sat on the head, brim low, face mostly in shadow. A reflective vest caught her headlights, but even that looked odd. Its stripes were placed differently than modern vests, thicker, arranged in patterns she'd seen in archive photos from decades past. The lantern lifted once, a small, economical motion. Not frantic, not pleading. More like a measured signal. You see this? Yes. You know to slow? Yes. Mara's heart made a brief, heavy thump against her ribs. Not of fear exactly, but of a sudden, heightened awareness. The road ahead curved sharply right, and now she saw that the fog there was thicker, denser, a soft, swirling wall. Beyond that, the faint suggestion of darker shapes hinted at trees encroaching close to the shoulder. She dipped her speed a bit more, fingers relaxing slightly on the wheel, letting the rig settle into caution. As she passed the figure, her eyes flicked sideways in spite of herself, searching for the details of the face, the lines of the hand that held the lantern. In the moving dance of headlights, fog, and motion, she saw only impressions: a jaw weathered and spare, the shadow of cheekbones, a mouth that might have been set in the patient line of someone focused on a task. The hand on the lantern looked pale, the knuckles prominent. It did not turn toward her cab. It seemed more intent on the curve ahead. Then the figure was behind her. She resisted the impulse to check the mirror immediately. She took the curve first, steady, tracking the lane lines carefully. The fog at the apex of the bend did indeed thicken in a sudden, localized bank, swallowing her beams almost to the bumper. For a breath, she drove on trust alone, on memory of the contour seen seconds ago. When she cleared it, the road straightened slightly. Only then did she flicker her eyes toward the right mirror, searching for the warm dot of lantern light receding behind. There was nothing, only the smooth gray wash of fog and the pale, ghostly wash of her own taillights illuminating it from behind. The shoulder appeared empty. The CB crackled softly above, a whisper of static rising and falling like someone taking a breath to speak, then changing their mind. Mara exhaled slowly, not fully realizing she had been holding that breath. The rational part of her mind offered several explanations: a highway worker in older gear, a trick of the light and fog combined with some reflective post, fatigue playing gentle pranks on her tired brain. Each had a certain plausibility. None sat quite right. 11 miles to the summit. She drove on. The fog seemed to pulse with the mountain's own slow breathing. It thinned momentarily at a turnout, revealing the pale shadow of picnic tables and a dark restroom building, then thickened again as she re-entered the main lane. The sound of her engine took on a slightly hollow quality, as if the mist itself were absorbing the higher tones. 5 minutes later, as she rounded another long, deceptive curve, the lantern appeared again. This time she saw it further ahead, a small point of amber against the gray, swaying gently at the side of the road. Her scalp prickled under her cap in a subtle wave. The same low-hanging glow, the same suggestion of a figure beyond it, coat and cap blurred, reflective vest catching her beams with that anachronistic pattern of stripes. Standing at the outer edge of the curve, just before the lane dropped away slightly on the right, where a shallow slide zone of gravel bore the faint scars of old tire tracks. The lantern lifted once more, in that calm, measured motion. Mara slowed. She was already moving cautiously, but now she brought her speed down to something almost sedate, the rumble of the engine deep and unhurried. Her truck responded as if relieved. The fog ahead seemed unbothered, continuing its silent, swirling dance. She passed the figure again. Again, the face remained an arrangement of hints instead of features. But this time, as her cab drew level, the lantern dipped slightly, almost like a nod. The CB came alive with a soft, faraway voice. It was thin, stretched by distance or time or both. "Eastbound on Cloudback, you seeing him tonight?" The words were faint, the consonants slightly blurred by static. The tone, however, was conversational, mild, a voice used to talking through long miles. Mara reached instinctively for the microphone, fingers wrapping around its familiar shape. "Copy that, I." Static swallowed her reply before it ever left the tip of the mic. At least, that's how it sounded to her ears. The moment her thumb pressed the talk button, the channel hissed, full and obscure, like someone had turned a river upstream into her speaker. Another voice, different, older, slid through the noise. "Let him walk you through, darling. Don't look too hard, just drive the road." The words were oddly formal, with a rhythm not quite modern, the way someone might have spoken 50 years ago. They blurred at the edges, but the core meaning came through as clearly as if the speaker were sitting in her passenger seat. She stared at the CB for a heartbeat, mic still in hand. Then, carefully, she set it back in its cradle, eyes never fully leaving the road. Outside, the lantern glow receded behind her once more. The fog closed in its wake, tender and impenetrable. The summit sign appeared at last, its reflective letters bright in her lights. CLOUDBACK past summit ELEV, 4,211 FT. Just beyond it, a small turnout branched off, marked scenic overlook. The arrow pointed to a tiny paved loop resting just above the main road, half contained by a low stone wall. Mara had never noticed the overlook before, though she had crossed this pass more times than she could count. Perhaps she had simply never driven it in quite this kind of fog, at quite this hour, with her attention balanced so delicately between road and something more ephemeral. On impulse, she clicked on her signal and eased off onto the spur. The pavement beneath her tires changed texture slightly, the vibrations different, older. Her rig rolled into the loop and she brought it to a gentle stop, close enough to the stone wall that she could have stepped out and touched it. The engine idled low, a comforting, steady thrum. She sat for a moment, hands resting lightly on her thighs, feeling the slight sway of the cab as the truck settled. Out here, separated from the main flow of the highway by only a short spur and a change in angle, the night felt deeper. The fog swirled beyond the windshield, lit from below by her own beams, making the world outside look like the inside of a softly glowing cloud. She turned off the headlights but left the marker lights and running lamps on. The cab dipped into a dimmer kind of illumination, cozy and close. Outside, the fog shifted from bright to pearly, outlined now only by the warm halo of her clearance lights and the slow blink of her hazard flashers. Mara listened. She heard the engine, the quiet ticking of hot metal beginning to cool, the soft whir of the heater fan. Beyond that, muted and far away, nothing. No other engines. No wind strong enough to move the trees. The mountain seemed to be holding its breath. She reached back for her thermos, poured the last of the now lukewarm coffee into the cup, and cradled it between her palms. The bitter, familiar taste grounded her, a tether to the ordinary. Then, from somewhere in front of the truck, beyond the faint spill of her running lights, a warm, amber glow began to grow. It didn't appear suddenly, it emerged. Gradually, as though edging around a corner only it could see. A small, golden circle of light, bobbing slightly in the fog, approaching with a measured pace. It stopped several yards from the nose of her rig, hovering there steady. The lantern. Even without the sharp focus of her headlights, she recognized its soft-edged brightness, the way the light pooled within the glass, sending out gentle rays. Behind it, the suggestion of a figure coalesced once more. Darker shape, long coat, brim of a cap. A reflective stripe glimmered faintly in the ambient glow. They stood like that for a moment, truck, driver, lantern bearer. The engine murmur filled the cab. The fog stroked softly along the edges of perception. Mara felt her heartbeat, slow but firm, a deep, grounding drum. She did not feel afraid. The strangeness of the moment was undeniable, but it came wrapped in a peculiar calm, as if she had wandered into a ritual that had been performed 1,000 times for 1,000 drivers before her. The lantern lifted a fraction, held. The figure's head inclined slightly, almost like a courteous greeting. In that tilt, in that stillness, there was a sense of purpose, of routine. This was not a spectacle. It was work. Quiet, necessary work. Mara found herself, without quite knowing why, giving the slightest nod in return. It was a small motion, barely more than a dip of the chin, but it felt acknowledged. The lantern's flame brightened for a heartbeat, growing a shade more golden. Then it turned, the light swinging gently as the figure pivoted away, moving toward the low stone wall at the overlook's edge. There should have been a drop beyond that wall, a view in daylight of the valley below. Now there was only fog, dense and milky, pooling up against the rough stone like water against a dam. The lantern reached the wall, paused, then moved on, passing through the fog as though through a curtain. The glow dimmed quickly, swallowed in layers, then winked out entirely, leaving only the soft silver gray of mist. Mara sat for a long moment after that, the cooling coffee in her hands untouched. The cab felt very small now, but also very safe. A little warm bubble on a high, fog-wrapped ridge. At some point, she would not later remember exactly when, her eyes grew heavy. The combination of engine lullaby, enveloping fog, and long hours did their work. She shifted into the sleeper, perhaps intending only to rest her eyes for a minute, boots still on, jacket still zipped halfway, the sound of the idling truck her steady companion. When she woke, light was filtering pale and clear through the cab's curtains. She blinked, feeling a momentary disorientation that came from realizing she had slept more deeply than intended. She checked the clock. It read 7:42. The engine was still idling, as steady as ever. Outside, the world looked different. She pulled the curtain aside. The fog was gone. In its place, the sharp, clean air of morning lay over the mountains, revealing an expanse of rolling, forested hills stretching away into hazy blue distance. Thin streamers of leftover mist still clung to the lower valleys, but up here the sky was a pale, washed-out blue, streaked with high, feathery clouds. The scenic overlook looked ordinary. The low stone wall was newer than it had seemed in the night, its mortar still light in the joints, the stones neatly cut. A green metal sign stood at one end of the loop, CLOUDBACK Summit Viewpoint, ELEV, 4211 FT. Another, smaller plaque was mounted to the stone wall itself, bronze catching the morning sun. Mara shut off the engine and climbed down from the cab. The air was crisp and cool against her face, carrying the scent of pine and cold soil, and something faintly metallic from the nearby guardrails. Birds called from the trees below, their voices bright and tentative in the early hour. She walked to the wall. The plaque was simple, its surface weathered slightly but still legible. In memory of those lost in the fog pileup of November 17, 1974. May the road rise to meet you, and may the light guide you home. Beneath the inscription, a list of names arranged in 2 columns: drivers, passengers, a highway patrol officer, a road worker. One name caught her eye: Henry Collins, flagger. The last name tickled some vague recognition, like a word seen in passing on a menu or a billboard. She couldn't put a memory to it, but the combination, Henry Collins, flagger, fog pileup, settled into her thoughts with quiet weight. Back in the cab, she flipped open her worn logbook, running her finger along the neat columns of time and mileage. The hours stacked up normally, each line telling the story of her night. Yet the distance between the town before the pass and the one after looked odd. She had covered the miles in less time than she would have expected in that grade and that fog, even with a stop at the overlook. It could have been any number of things: favorable traffic, slightly off recollection of usual times, the elastic nature of memory at 3 in the morning. The GPS track on her phone showed a smooth, uninterrupted line over the pass, with a brief stationary point at the summit. Nothing to suggest loops, or lost hours, or any of the more dramatic stories that sometimes circulated in late-night lounges. At the next truck stop down in the valley, The small diner attached to the fuel island had the familiar, comforting smells of frying eggs, warm toast, and strong coffee. The walls were decorated with photographs of the surrounding mountains in every season: lush green, blazing autumn, winter white. Behind the counter, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a name tag that read Linda topped off Mara's mug. "Came over Cloudback this morning?" she asked, in the tone of someone to whom this was conversational shorthand. "Last night," Mara said. "Foggy up there." Linda's brows lifted slightly. "Still throwing that blanket on things, is it? My daddy used to work that stretch, road crew, back before they put in half the safety measures they got now." She paused, then added in a quieter voice, "Back before the pileup." Mara hesitated, then said, "There's a plaque up at the Overlook. Mentions a flagger, Henry Collins." Linda's gaze dropped, a small, fond, sad smile touching her mouth. "Hank, yeah, that be him. Folks said he ran out into the fog trying to wave folks down that night. Saved some, they said, didn't save himself." Her fingers tapped lightly on the coffee pot's handle. "Funny thing, some drivers still talk about seeing a lantern on the worst nights. Silly story, I always figured. But it's a nice thought, isn't it? Someone up there watching the curves." Mara looked down into her coffee, at the way the surface vibrated just a little when a truck rolled past outside. "Nice thought," she agreed quietly. Stories like that had their own life. They lived between people, kept aloft by shared retellings. Whether the lantern was memory, imagination, or something stranger didn't change the way driving that pass in thick fog could make a person feel very small and very watched over at the same time. Some nights when the clouds settled low and thick along Cloudback's ribs, an eastbound driver would ease into the climb and find, just at the edge of their sight, a soft, amber glow. It would be there at the dangerous bend, at the unexpected dip, at the place where the old slide scars waited. Never shouting, never startling, just present. A quiet suggestion of where the road truly went. Most would pass, lungs a bit tighter, fingers holding the wheel a bit closer, and carry that image with them into the valley. Later, recounting it over coffee or in the warmth of a sleeper bunk, the edges of the memory would fuzz. Details would rearrange themselves, as memories of fog often did. But in the thickest hours of the night, when the world narrowed to painted lines and the gentle hum of tires on wet pavement, some part of them would recall that lantern on the mountain. And the mountain, vast and ancient and patient, would continue to let the fog roll and lift, the road threading its way along its spine, watched over by whatever lights chose to linger there longer than most. Story number 3. The lowlands had a way of holding onto the night. Long after towns and cities had traded darkness for the soft pallets of dawn, the marshes and flat fields along the interstate still cradled the hours between. Fog pooled there, thick and quiet, a slow-moving tide that slid across the road and swallowed sound. Elias drove through it with the steadiness of someone who had seen all kinds of weather and learned not to argue with any of it. His truck, an older but well-kept blue Freightliner, rumbled contentedly along the center lane, the engine's low song running like a reassurance through the floorboards and up into his bones. The dash glowed with a cluster of muted lights, speedometer needle holding just under the posted limit, fuel gauge hovering above the halfway mark, clock digits declaring the time as 2:47 a.m. Beyond the windshield, the world was distilled into only what mattered to keep moving. 2 bright white lines, one solid and one dashed, curving gently ahead. The shadowy suggestion of guardrails, the pallid, shifting walls of fog that pressed up against the beams and refused to let him see farther than he had to. The radio was turned down low, just enough that the soft murmur of some overnight talk program bled into the edges of his awareness. A host with a warm, unhurried voice was speaking about dreams, how the mind stitched scraps of memory into stories when no one was looking. Callers phoned in from kitchen tables and parked cars, their words riding on a river of static. Elias sipped lukewarm coffee from his stainless mug, his other hand resting lightly on the wheel at the 5 o'clock position. The coffee was bitter and a little burned, but its familiar bite helped keep his thoughts from sinking too deep into the softness of the hour. He had been on this particular stretch of interstate many times before, though usually in better visibility. He knew that to either side of him lay open fields, patches of scrub, the occasional farmhouse light set far back from the highway. Tonight, all of that was erased. The fog lay thick over the land, a pale, luminous blanket that made distance meaningless. A sign appeared suddenly from the whiteness on the right, its reflective face sending back his own light. Rest area 10 miles. Benson Creek. He glanced at the fuel gauge again, then at the dash clock. There was no pressing need to stop, but the thought of stepping out of the cab, stretching his legs, and refilling his thermos with something fresher than the dregs at his elbow tugged at him. His back had begun to send out those low, quiet complaints that promised to become louder if ignored. He flipped his CB to a different channel, one sometimes used for local highway updates. Only static answered, soft and even, like rain heard from far away. The miles slid under his tires. The fog did not thin. If anything, it seemed to thicken as he descended into a lower stretch of land, the road flattening out and running straighter. The reflective posts at the edge of the shoulder appeared and disappeared like the ticks of some large, patient clock. Another sign rode up out of the mist, rest area 2 miles. Benson Creek, vending/RESTROOMS/pet area. He realized with a small flicker of surprise that he did not remember ever actually using this rest area. He knew its name, of course. It was printed on 100 route plans and dot maps. But in his memory, the stretch between the last truck stop and the small city ahead had always been one long, uninterrupted drive. He watched carefully for the approach of the off-ramp. The fog made distance deceptive. Exit signs seemed to pop into existence at the last second. His fingers tightened slightly on the wheel, ready. There, a green rectangle blossoming out of the white. Rest area 1 mile. Then, almost immediately, the smaller exit-only panel beneath. Rest area BENSON Creek. He clicked on his right blinker. The soft tick-tick filled the cab, oddly loud against the hush of the night. The exit lane unfurled to the right, its dividing line a stripe of bright paint vanishing into milk. He eased the truck into it, feeling the change in road texture as he left the mainline. The engine tone shifted, a subtle drop as the grade rose just slightly. The ramp curved gently away from the interstate, dipping under an overpass that should have been the very same highway he had just left. The concrete pillars loomed suddenly, then slipped past. On the other side, the fog redistributed itself, a little thinner, showing him more of the world than it had before. The rest area opened ahead like a small, dimly lit harbor. Tall sodium vapor lamps stood at regular intervals, their amber light pooling on damp pavement in lazy circles. The added illumination turned the fog into something visible and textured, swirling in slow eddies above the asphalt. A low, brick building sat at the center of the lot, its windows glowing softly. On one side of the building, a row of vending machines glimmered, rows of candy bars and drinks caught behind glass. The truck parking area stretched to the right, wide, flat, and empty. Not a single rig sat sleeping under the pale lights. The absence of other trucks registered in Elias' mind like a change in pressure. At this hour, even the most modest rest areas usually had at least 1 or 2 long-haul rigs using the place as a brief refuge between obligations. He rolled in slowly, his tires hissing over damp pavement. As his headlights swept across the lot, painted lines, curbs, and trash cans leapt out in brief, sharp relief before returning to the soft wash of amber. Nothing moved besides his own truck, the fog, and a few moths orbiting a distant lamp. He chose a spot not too far from the building and eased the truck in, straightening with the practiced motions of someone who had been aligning vehicle to paint for more than half his life. The engine ticked down to idle, Then he flipped the key and let the big diesel fall silent. The sudden quiet was almost startling. In its place came smaller sounds, the cooling ticks of metal, the faint hum of the truck's auxiliary systems, the soft patter of unseen moisture dripping from trees onto pavement. Beyond that, Benson Creek Rest Area held a hush so complete it seemed almost deliberate. Elias wrapped his fingers around the handle of his mug, opened the door, and climbed down. The air that met him was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of wet concrete, cut grass, and distant standing water. The fog was finer here, almost a mist, turning the sodium lights into fuzzy halos. His boots met the ground with a muted thud. The massive shape of his truck loomed behind him, dark, solid, a comforting silhouette in an otherwise empty space. He walked toward the building. The closer he drew, the more details he noticed. The bricks were an older style, slightly irregular, with mortar that had weathered to a soft gray. The roofline was low, angled gently, its shingles darkened uniformly as though by many seasons' worth of rain. The sign above the main entrance was metal with embossed lettering, BNSON Creek Rest Area. The typography looked a little outdated, rounded corners, slightly stylized capitals that reminded him of photos from the 70s or 80s. The glass doors parted easily when he pulled on the handle, their metal frames cool beneath his palm. Inside, the air was warmer than outside by a few degrees, and carried the distinct scent of institutional cleaning solutions, dry paper towels, and something else faintly sweet, perhaps coffee from long-ago vending machines. The lobby was lit by overhead fluorescent panels, but the bulbs were not of the harsh, blue-white modern kind. These glowed softer, a slightly yellowed hue that made the space feel oddly timeless. A row of informational pamphlets lined one wall, their colors muted from age. The maps on their covers showed highways in slightly different configurations than he knew them today, routes that had since been widened, rerouted, or renamed. A glass-fronted display case stood near the door. Inside, behind streak-free panels, sat an assortment of local artifacts, a rusted horseshoe, a photograph of the creek in some bygone flood, a small model of an old bridge. A small brass plaque at the bottom read, Benson Creek, Gateway to the Lowlands, 1959. The vending machine corner hummed quietly to his left. The machines were older models, their buttons larger, labels slightly faded. The candy selection was a curious blend of modern and nostalgic, familiar brands alongside a few logos he hadn't seen in years. A soda machine showed prices that seemed a little too low for him. The present day. The printed card above the coin slot listed numbers that made his mind do a small double take. He stepped into the men's room. The tiles were clean, the mirrors unspotted, the trash can neatly lined and mostly empty. At the far end, near the sinks, a small, narrow window was set high in the wall. Through it, he could see only fog, pressed against the glass like the side of some pale, patient animal. As he washed his hands, the sound of the water echoing softly off the ceramic, he realized he had yet to hear any indication that he was not alone. No muffled coughs from the stalls, no distant thud of another truck door closing outside, no shuffling footsteps in the lobby. When he stepped back into the main area, a figure was standing by the vending machines. The man was medium height, wearing dark work pants and a collared shirt under a light jacket that had the words Highway SCRVICES stitched on the chest in old-fashioned script. His hairline had receded a little, and his hair, what remained, was cut short, the color somewhere between brown and gray. His face had the kind of weathering that came from working outdoors in all kinds of weather. Fine lines around the eyes, a mild permanent squint as if still adjusting from sun to shade. He held a clipboard at his side, pen tucked into its spring clip. In his other hand, he balanced a styrofoam cup that sent up a faint ribbon of steam. The smell of black coffee, strong and uncomplicated, rode gently on the air. "Even in," the man said, though the clock on the wall clearly declared it was edging toward 3 in the morning. His voice carried an easy, unhurried cadence. "You're mackin' good time through the soup." Elias nodded, something in him relaxing at the simple presence of another human. "Yeah, fog's thick as stew out there." He glanced at the man's jacket. "Didn't expect anybody on duty this late." The man smiled slightly, the expression creasing the corners of his eyes. "We keep an eye on things. Folks ride harder than they ought to sometimes in weather like this. Nice to have a place to catch their breath when the road starts feeling too long." Elias looked around. "Quiet tonight," he said. "Thought I'd see at least one other rig parked." The man followed his gaze to the empty lot through the glass doors. "You just missed a couple," he said. "Westbound convoy pulled out a half hour ago. Fog swallowed 'em up soon as they hit the ramp." He took a sip of his coffee, then nodded toward Elias' empty mug. "They keep the hot water in there fairly fresh." He gestured to a small alcove near the restrooms. "Kinda stuff tastes better at 3 a.m. anyway." Elias moved toward the alcove. A small, stainless steel hot water dispenser sat on a counter beside a lidded trash can. Above it, a simple printed sign with curled edges read "Complimentary hot water. Please enjoy responsibly." The edges of the paper had browned slightly with age. Steam curled from the dispenser's spout as he pressed it, filling his mug with clear, near-boiling water. He added a coffee packet from his own supply, the smell quickly unraveling into the air. From somewhere deeper within the building, a soft mechanical clunk sounded, followed by a brief whir. It might have been a compressor kicking on, or some aging piece of infrastructure shifting its weight. The rest area's bones settling. "Been a long haul?" the attendant asked, as Elias stirred the coffee with a small plastic stick. "Started in the city before sundown," Elias said. "Headed east. Figured I'd push through the night and catch a few hours at a truck stop on the other side of the lowlands." The man's eyes drifted briefly toward the window as if he could see through it to the fog beyond. "Best to move careful down there in this stuff," he said. "It plays with distance, makes the miles stretch and fold." He tapped his clipboard lightly against his thigh. "Some folks swear this place shows up when they most need it, even when it's not on their plan." Elias gave a small, wry smile. "Sounds like something out of one of those late-night shows." He gestured vaguely toward the ceiling, where the talk radio program still murmured faintly from some unseen speaker. The man's smile deepened a fraction. "You'd be surprised," he said. "Road got its own way of looking out for people once in a while." Elias glanced at the wall clock above the doors. The second hand moved smoothly, without stutter. The time read 3:06 a.m. He had the passing thought that the fog might not be eager to let him go, that staying a little longer might mean having to push daylight windows on the other end. But his body was already thanking him for the brief interruption, the chance to stand, stretch, let his eyes adjust to non-moving walls. A map was mounted to the wall near the entrance. Its colors were slightly sun-faded, the paper beneath the laminate a touch yellowed. It showed the interstate they were on as a thick blue line, the surrounding state roads as thinner veins. His finger traced their current position. The oddness struck him slowly like a delayed echo. Benson Creek Rest Area was marked, a small icon beside the highway, but its label had a thin red X through it. Next to that, in small print, closed future site improvements. He blinked, leaned closer. The revision date on the map, in tiny print at the bottom corner, read, "Updated to 2003. "Map's out of date," the attendant said, appearing at his elbow as though he had known exactly which detail Elias' eyes had snagged on. "They haven't swapped 'em yet. Budget cycles and all that." His tone was light, but there was a softness in his gaze that suggested an awareness of the peculiar little dissonance. Elias huffed a quiet breath that was almost a laugh. "I've been driving this route since 09, he said. "Don't remember ever seeing the exit open before tonight." The man took another sip of coffee, then looked up at the map himself. "Funny how that works," he murmured. "Sometimes you drive right past something 100 times and don't see it until the night you need it." He set his cup on a nearby ledge, the faint styrofoam squeak oddly loud in the quiet. Road like that. People too. Outside, a truck drove past on the main line, unseen but heard. A distant, low rush punctuated by the rhythmic slap of tires over seams. For a moment, the sound seemed to echo strangely, as if doubled. Then it faded back into the fog. Elias checked his watch, then the wall clock again. The 2 times matched. He felt rested enough for a while longer. The thought of climbing back into his cab and easing once more into the soft, blank tunnel of fog seemed less daunting now. "Appreciate the stop," he said, lifting his mug a little in a half-dozed. "Place has good atmosphere." The man chuckled softly. "We aim to provide a little island out of the soup." His eyes crinkled again at the corners. "You take it easy out there. Watch for the low spots. Fog sticks there like it's got nowhere better to be." Elias pushed open the glass doors. The cool mist met him again, wrapping around his face and seeping into the collar of his jacket. The rest area lot lay quiet, his blue rig the only large thing in sight. The tall lights hummed faintly, casting their amber halos. He climbed back into the cab, set his refreshed mug in the holder, and let the familiar small ritual steady him. Seatbelt click, key twist, the slow rise of engine noise as the truck came back to life. The cab trembled gently as everything spun up. In his side mirror, through the faint haze clinging to the glass, he could see the rest area building, its bricks softened by fog, its windows glowing dimly. A figure moved behind the glass for a moment, then disappeared deeper inside. He pulled out slowly, tires crunching lightly over a patch of loose gravel at the edge of the pavement. The ramp back to the interstate curved upward, its reflectors winking one by one as his headlights caught them. The fog thinned at the top of the rise, then thickened again as he merged with the main line, the white lines guiding him forward. Within minutes, the rest area was gone behind him, swallowed by distance and mist. He drove on for another hour, then 2. The fog along the lowlands persisted, sometimes thinning to a delicate veil, sometimes thickening into denser pockets that required him to ease off the throttle and lean a little closer to the wheel. The radio talk show gave way to soft music, then to the early bones of a morning news program. When the sky finally began to lighten at the eastern edge, the fog took on a different character. It shifted from luminous gray to pale, ghostly white, then slowly, reluctantly began to peel away from the fields. Dark stands of trees emerged from beneath it. The gleam of a distant water tower caught the first hint of pink. In daylight, the highway felt like a different place altogether. Later that morning, after fueling up at a truck stop on the outskirts of the next city, Elias struck up a conversation with another driver at the counter. The other man was younger, his jacket emblazoned with the logo of a regional carrier. "Fog was thick as thieves out on the lowlands last night," Elias said conversationally, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Lucky for me, Benson Creek rest area was open. Got a chance to stretch." The younger driver frowned, spoon halfway to his mouth. "Benson Creek," he repeated. "You mean mile 182. "Think so," Elias said. "Sign said Benson Creek. Brick building, older vending machines. Attendant on duty." He smiled faintly, recalling the easy, steady presence of the man with the clipboard. The younger driver let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. "Man, they closed that place years ago," he said. "Ground started sinking under part of the lot. Dot shut it down and fenced it off. Future improvements and all that. Now it's just trees and some busted-up pavement, far as I've heard." A small, quiet chill slid gently along the back of Elias' neck. Not sharp, not startling, more like the cool edge of a draft in an otherwise warm room. "You sure?" he asked, careful to keep his tone neutral. "Pretty sure," the younger driver said, dropping his sugar packet into the trash. "Been running this route 6 months. My trainer used to point it out, said he remembered when it was open way back. But I've never seen it anything but closed. No lights, no nothing, even in daytime. He shrugged. Maybe you hit some new construction or something. They love throwing up surprise detours these days. Elias thought of the warm amber pools of sodium light, the humming fluorescent glow inside, the map with its red X and promises of future changes, the attendant's calm, steady gaze, and the way his hand had rested on the clipboard as if that, too, was part of a long, familiar routine. "Yeah," he said after a moment, "must have been something like that." Back in his cab, he opened his logbook. His pen had traced the hours neatly, marking the brief stop at Benson Creek as if it were any other place along the route. 03000315 rest area, Benson Creek. Beside the notation out of habit, he had jotted a small comment. Good coffee. Quiet. He glanced at the dash clock. Then, almost without thinking, he looked at his mug. The stainless steel walls were warm to the touch, not hot, just comfortably heated. The coffee inside still held the faint, particular taste of water that had passed through older pipes, tinged with a metallic softness that differed from the sharpness of his own truck's kettle. He looked out at the highway unfurling ahead, the day gathering itself around the world. Cars moved now in growing numbers. Billboards flashed past, their messages bolder in the light. The fog was retreating to low-lying ditches and distant tree lines, its dominion temporarily ceded. Out in the lowlands, where the interstate rubbed shoulders with the marshes and the flat, quiet fields, there was a closed rest area marked with a red X on maps and a promise of future improvements. In the daylight, drivers passing by saw only overgrown access roads, a cracked loop of pavement disappearing into saplings, maybe a rusting chain across an entrance. But in certain conditions, on certain nights, in the thickest run of fog, some eastbound or westbound trucker would see a green sign for Benson Creek Rest Area appear out of the whiteness. They would feel their shoulders aching, their eyes burning just enough to make the lure of a stop irresistible. They would take the ramp. They'd find lights burning, walls humming softly, the smell of cleaning solution and old coffee in the air. They might exchange a few words with a quiet attendant in an outdated jacket, or simply sit on the edge of their bunk for 15 minutes, letting the stillness soak into them. Then they'd merge back onto the highway and continue into whatever awaited them beyond the fog. Later, over counters and coffee cups, when someone insisted the place had been closed for years, their memories would grow soft around the edges. They'd shrug, allow for tricks of mind and map, attribute the oddness to fatigue. A person could only hold so much strangeness before filing the rest away in a drawer labeled probably nothing. But for a handful of moments, in the deepest part of a fog-wrapped night, there had been a small, warm island at Benson Creek, its lights reaching gently out through the mist, its doors opening and closing with the quiet, unremarkable kindness of a place built simply to give travelers a brief, needed pause between miles. Story number 4. The river plain flattened out beneath the midnight sky, a wide, low bowl of land where water and earth braided together in slow, winding patterns. Canals, ditches, and back channels traced faint, meandering lines through the darkness, and somewhere beyond the reach of headlights. The main river slid patiently toward the sea. Above it all, the interstate crossed on a long, level bridge, concrete and steel raised just high enough to stay clear of the seasonal floods. At night, from a distance, the bridge looked like a thin, pale thread laid gently over ink. On this particular night, the river was invisible. Fog had moved in after sundown, drifting up from the water in quiet layers. It gathered first in the low spots, then rolled inch by inch across the flats. By the time the clock in Nate's cab pushed past 1:30 a.m., the fog had thickened into a white, luminous curtain that seemed to hang less from the sky than rise from the ground. His truck moved toward it like a ship into cloud. Inside the cab, the world was small, warm, and familiar. The dash lights glowed in soft amber and green. The faint reflection of his hands on the wheel hovered ghost-like in the lower edge of the glass. The radio's backlight showed a string of unremarkable numbers. 63 mph, outside temperature 42 degrees, time 1:38 a.m. Nate's rig was a late model Peterbilt, its engine tuned to that contented, low-frequency hum that could be felt more than heard. Through the soles of his boots, the seatback against his shoulders, the steering column under his fingers. The air in the cab smelled faintly of coffee, clean laundry, and the lingering trace of the pine-scented wipes he used to keep the surfaces from getting that tacky road film. The CB mic hung within easy reach, its coiled cord swaying gently with the truck's subtle movement. Channel 19 was alive with a low background murmur, voices drifting in and out as the terrain rose and fell. He wasn't alone on the road tonight. A loose convoy of 3 trucks had found each other just after midnight, sliding together by unspoken agreement, the way rigs often did on long, quiet runs. The company names on the trailers were different, the colors varied, but their speeds and directions matched so neatly that it made sense to move as one. Up ahead, maybe a quarter mile by Nate's estimation, rolled a refrigerated trailer with a faded red logo, Beacon FOODS. In his right mirror, tucked neatly behind him at a respectful distance, was a flatbed carrying what looked like large, shrink-wrapped machinery, its outline softened by the night. Their voices floated intermittently through his cab, tiny presences that made the night feel less empty. "Fog's thickening at the bottom of the grade," came the lead driver's voice, calm and matter-of-fact. His handle was Beacon. He had the easy, measured tone of someone who had been doing this a very long time. "Keep your eyes peeled for that bridge. It can sneak up on you when it gets real soupy." Behind Nate, the flatbed driver chimed in. His handle was Harlan. "Copy that, Beacon. Been a while since I ran this late. Feels like driven inside a snow globe." Nate lifted the mic. "Breaker for Beacon and Harlan. This is Nightjar in the middle. Appreciate the heads up." "Good to have you ridden with us, Nightjar," Beacon replied. "Easier to keep track of the ghosts when we're together." There was a lightness to the remark, but under it, something slightly more serious. A worn familiarity with stories shared in truck stop diners and smoky lounges, the kind of stories that came out after second cups of coffee at 3 a.m. Beyond the windshield, the fog drew closer. It began as a hazy band across the distant highway, then thickened into a luminous wall that swallowed the stars and erased the horizon. The high beams turned it into a flat, featureless glow, so Nate dipped them, relying on his low beams and fog lights to carve a narrower, more navigable tunnel. The interstate slipped into it with no fanfare. One moment, there was a hint of distant tree line and faint starlight above. The next, everything beyond the immediate reach of his lights disappeared. The fog here was dense, almost textured. It moved in slow, lazy swirls over the pavement, flattening out under the weight of his beams. Moisture beaded on the wiper arms and along the edges of the windshield. The road itself shone darkly where moisture had gathered. His headlights turned the wet asphalt into a faint, silvery ribbon edged in white and yellow. His world shrank to that ribbon and the gentle sway of the gauges. "Welcome to the river," Beacon's voice came, a low, steady presence in the small space of Nate's cab. "Bridge is about 5 miles ahead. They say the fog likes to sit over the water like it's got nowhere better to be." "Any truth to the stories?" Harlan asked. "Heard things about this crossing." Nate had heard them too. Every long-haul route had its own collection of tailies, lights seen where no lights should be, voices over the radio that didn't match any call sign, exits that appeared and vanished. For this particular bridge, the story usually went something like, years ago, in fog just like this, a chain reaction pileup had taken place in the small hours. Dozens of vehicles, weeks of cleanup. After that, people spoke about phantom convoys, ghostly headlights in the mist. "They're just stories," Beacon said, but his tone carried a shading that suggested stories, in his experience, often contained more than one kind of truth. "Key is, we keep the distance and the speed sensible. Fog can't hurt you if you respect it." Nate checked his speed, felt his right foot ease up without conscious thought. The truck settled into a slightly slower pace, the engine note dropping a fraction. In the mirror, Harlan's headlights floated behind him, two pale orbs softened by mist but steady, dependable. A mile marker slid past on the right, 136. The reflective numbers flared in his headlights, then dissolved into the white behind him. The rumble of the road joints under his tires spaced themselves a little farther apart on the approach to the bridge. The CB gave a brief wash of static, then Beacon's voice cut through again, quieter, like someone speaking a bit closer to the mic. "All right, boys, ramp up here, where the river starts. We'll ease it down few more and keep our spacing. Nightjar, you hold steady where you are. Harlan, you keep that safe distance. No heroics, no worries." "Copy that," Nate said. His voice sounded slightly softer in his own ears, as if the fog outside had somehow seeped through the cab walls and thickened the air inside. He watched the faint glow of Beacon's taillights ahead, two dull red points hanging in the whiteness. The ramp to the bridge felt less like an incline and more like a transition. The asphalt changed tone under his tires, the sound shifting subtly as the truck left solid ground for the long concrete span above the river. The fog over the water was a different creature than the fog over the fields. It was heavier closer, its particles finer, more insistent. It wrapped around the bridge, blurring the railings and hiding the water below completely. The sense of space dropped away. For all Nate could see, his truck could have been moving along a road suspended in a blank, endless void. The only anchors were the white lane lines under his wheels, and the faint, steady red glow of Beacon's taillights up ahead. For a while, that was enough. The convoy moved like three beads on an invisible string, Beacon in front, Nate in the middle, Harlan behind. The fog closed them in, but it also made their small, shared universe feel self-contained, almost cozy in its own strange way. They spoke occasionally on the radio, keeping one another company. "Traffic's light," Harlan said once. "Feels like we're the only ones out here." "Most folks don't choose a night like this for river crossings," Beacon replied. "Leaves the bridge for us in the fog." "Works for me," Nate said. "I'll take fog over ice any day." The bridge stretched on. Mile marker signs were replaced here by small, green placards bolted to the side rail, their numbers only intermittently visible in the murk. The lights from the occasional lamp on a far-off fishing pier or service road below were entirely swallowed. After a time that felt simultaneously long and unmeasured, Nate glanced back into his right mirror, checking the position of Harlan's headlights. At first he saw them, two pale, round shapes in the fog spaced just where they should be. Then, in the span of a heartbeat, they seemed to dim, as if a veil had dropped between them and his mirror. The next moment they were gone. He blinked, leaned a fraction closer, angling the mirror adjuster with a practiced flick of his fingers. The glass shifted, catching more of the lane behind. Nothing. Only fog, the faint glow of his own taillights reflected back at him, and the vague suggestion of the bridge's receding edge. His hand moved automatically toward the CB mic. "Breaker Harlan, you still with us back there?" Static answered first, a low, even hiss that filled the cab for a few seconds. Then Harlan's voice slid through it, clear and easy. "Still breathin', Nightjar, you lose me." Nate exhaled, not realizing until then that he had been holding his breath. "Just didn't see your lights for a second. Might be the angle." "Fog plays tricks," Harlan said. "I got your trailer big as life up ahead. No worries." Nate checked the mirrors again. Still nothing. His rational mind supplied explanations. Denser patch of fog between them, slight curve in the bridge hiding the headlights, his own eyes tired, seeing patterns and then losing them. "Beacon, you reading us both?" Nate asked. Beacon's reply came with a faint background hum, like the sound of tires on wet pavement. Loud and clear. "You're sittin' about 20 back from me, Nightjar. Harlan, about the same behind you. Bridge doesn't leave much room to wander. Just keep your hands steady and your mind where your wheels are. The reassurance helped. Nate's fingers loosened a little on the wheel. The white lines under his truck flowed steadily past. Beacon's taillights ahead remained visible, small, consistent, unhurried. Yet something in the quality of the light from those taillights tugged at the edges of his attention. In the soft blurring effect of the fog, they looked older somehow. Not the sharper LED bright glow of newer rigs, but the warmer, slightly duller red of older incandescent bulbs. Now that he noticed it, other details seemed to align with that impression. The shape of Beacon's trailer looked a fraction more boxy, the angles a little less smoothed. The company logo, when he caught a clearer glimpse of it in the swirling mist, appeared worn in a way that went beyond simple road dust. "Beacon, you run this river much?" Nate asked, partly to distract himself from thoughts spinning in odd directions. "Run it a fair bit," Beacon replied. "First time was," he paused as if counting years. "Lord, must be closer to 30 summers back now. Back when this bridge still smelled of new concrete. You were probably still about bicycles, Nightjar." "I was climbing trees," Nate said. "Didn't know an interstate from a gravel road." Beacon chuckled softly, the sound carrying a shape of fondness. "She was a rougher run back then. No median barrier. Just you, a rail, and a whole lot of water and fog beneath." Nate frowned slightly. "No median. Thought they put that in when they built it." "They did," Harlan's voice interjected. "At least that's what my atlas shows." Static rose briefly between them, a soft, gentle swell, like a small wave touching shore. "You boys must be of the rebuild," Beacon said after a moment. "Came later, after the big one." His voice had gone a shade quieter. "Thick fog night like this, folks didn't respect it. Day after that, nobody talked about anything else." Nate's foot eased another fraction off the throttle. The truck responded with the faintest sense of relief, the vibration through the seat softening. "How bad?" he asked, though he could already imagine the rest of the story along familiar lines. "Bad enough they changed the rules," Beacon said. "Dropped the speed for heavy fog, put up new signs, reworked the lanes. We started running in small packs on nights like this. More eyes, more radios. Didn't want anyone crossing alone until they ironed out what they could." Nate listened to the words, to the slight distortion at the edges of Beacon's voice. The way it sounded, for brief instants, as if it were coming not just through the present hiss of the CB, but through some older, more distant layer of static as well. Somewhere beneath the bridge, a ship's horn sounded, low and resonant. It reached them through the fog as a soft, sustained note, more felt than heard. It gave the impression of something vast moving steadily through the whiteness below, unseen but very much real. Nate checked his gauges. Everything read normal. The clock showed. He had the odd sensation that more time had passed than the digits suggested. The fog thickened further near what he guessed must be the center of the span. The tunnel of visibility narrowed until Beacon's taillights became faint, two small, pulsing points of red in a field of white. The road markings blurred. The edges of the bridge disappeared entirely. He could not see the guardrail, the support structures, or anything that proved the presence of earth or water beneath. There was only the truck, the road deck beneath it, and the unbroken fog pressing in from all sides. "All right, boys," Beacon's voice came lower now, almost an intimate murmur. "We're in the thick of it. No sudden moves. Nightjar, you hold on to my lights and nothing else. Harlan, you hold on to Nightjar." Nate's hands settled more firmly on the wheel, but not in a white-knuckled grip. There was, despite the disorienting conditions, a strange calm to the moment. The world had shrunk to the length of his headlights, and the sound of two other drivers sharing the crossing with him. "See you right up there," Harlan said quietly. "Got your back, Nightjar." For a little while, the only sounds were the steady rumble of the engine, the soft hiss of tires on damp concrete, and the faint background whisper of static on the radio. Time became difficult to measure. Seconds could have been minutes, Minutes could have been seconds. Then, very faintly, he heard his own handle spoken in a way that made the hairs at the nape of his neck stir. "Nightjar," Beacon said. The tone carried a subtle difference, like a record shifted by a fraction of a speed. "You're gonna feel a little leftward sway up. Bridge takes a breath there. Don't follow the feeling, follow the line. You copy?" Nate swallowed lightly. "Copy, Beacon. Leftward sway, trust the lines." "Good man," came the reply, accompanied by a small crackle of static. He watched the lane ahead. The white stripes were faint but present, ghosts of paint guiding him forward. Something in the subtle play of his inner ear and the motion of the truck gave him the impression, a moment later, that the entire structure of the bridge was drifting left, as if being slowly, gently pushed by some invisible hand. In that instant, his body wanted to correct, to steer right to counterbalance the perceived movement, but his eyes held the lane markings. They remained true, straight ahead. He kept the wheel steady. The false sway passed like a momentary dizziness. The lines never left their place. "Nice and easy," Beacon's voice said, from both very near and very far away. "You're just fine." The fog ahead of him shifted. It did not clear suddenly. There was no dramatic curtain lifting, but it thinned by layers. First he could see a little farther, then a little farther still. The indistinct white became streaked with hints of darker gray, the suggestion of structure beyond. A vague, looming shape on the right coalesced into a light pole. The ghost of a railing returned along the edge of his vision. Up ahead, Beacon's taillights flared a shade brighter in the cleaner air, then blinked once as the other driver tapped his brakes in a small, acknowledging gesture. Nate glanced into his right mirror. For a breath, he saw a pair of headlights behind him, dimmed, blurred as if seen through gauze. The shape that held them was difficult to parse, more suggestion than solid form. There was the impression of an older tractor design, more squared off, with a logo on the door he couldn't quite read. Then the fog between them rolled like a soft wave, and the reflection dissolved. His mirror showed only his own trailer edge and the pale, retreating whiteness of the bridge behind. "Beacon Harlan, we coming out of it?" he asked, thumb resting gently on the talk button. Static rose in answer, then fell. The line was suddenly empty. "Beacon," he tried again. "Harlan, you boys still up there?" Nothing. Only the thin, ever-present hiss of the channel, and the distant, nearly imperceptible pop of some far-off transmission he couldn't quite catch. He checked the channel, confirmed the dial hadn't slipped. Everything was tuned exactly as it had been minutes before. Up ahead, the end of the bridge appeared out of the thinning fog, a darker mass where the structure met solid ground. Streetlights on the far bank glowed a muted yellow through the remaining moisture in the air. Beyond them, the suggestion of trees and low buildings formed a mottled horizon. Beacon's truck was not there. No red taillights led the way off the span. No silhouette of a trailer moved between Nate and the exit. The lane ahead of him lay clear and empty, the white stripes unbroken all the way to the curve down onto the riverbank. In his mirror, there were no headlights, no shape of Harlan's flatbed, only the long, receding line of the bridge, already half swallowed again by the fog behind. Nate's chest rose and fell in a slow, deliberate breath. His hands were steady on the wheel, his foot light on the throttle. The truck rolled off the bridge and back onto the approach lanes as though nothing at all were amiss. The clock on the dash read 2:10 a.m. He reached for the GPS mounted on the dash, eyes flicking briefly to the little digital map. It showed his icon crossing the river in a clean, straight line. The estimated time between the last marked exit and the next had shortened by a handful of minutes, as if some small inefficiency in the original calculation had been quietly corrected. At the next truck stop, 15 miles beyond the far bank, Nate pulled in for fuel. Morning was still a few hours off, but the thickest of the fog had begun to lift inland. The lot lay under a thin veil, the bright lights from the pumps turning the moisture in the air into floating, glittering particles. Inside the small diner attached to the station, a few drivers sat scattered at booths, their faces carrying the softened features of the very late or the very early. A television mounted in one corner played some cable news channel at low volume. The smell of frying bacon and strong coffee warmed the air. Nate took a stool at the counter. The woman behind it, apron tied, pen tucked behind one ear, poured him a mug without asking. "River fog still out there?" she asked, her voice carrying the rounded vowels of someone who had lived near that river all her life. "Thick on the bridge," Nate said. "Ran it with a couple other trucks, Beacon Foods in front, flatbed behind." He paused, then added, "Voices on the radio at least." The woman's gaze flicked up at that, her eyes narrowing slightly in curiosity. "Beacon Foods," she repeated. "Now there's a name I haven't heard in a while." "Seen their trailers here and there," Nate said. "Older units. This one looked like it had some years on it." She set the coffee pot down, her fingers resting lightly on its handle. "My brother used to drive for Beacon," she said. "Did runs over that bridge all the time, back before they did the rebuild." She gestured vaguely in the direction of the river. "That fog's got a mind of its own some nights. We lost him out there. Fog pileup long time ago now." Nate felt a quiet stillness settle over him, the way calm sometimes fell in the eye of a mild storm. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. She nodded once, accepting the sympathy with the practiced ease of someone to whom the story had become both wound and scar. "He was in a convoy," she added. "Small one. Said it made him feel better knowing there were other voices on the line when they went into the soup. Afterward, you'd hear folks talk. Drivers saying they heard Beacon's boys on the radio on the thickest nights, even when company'd been gone for years." Her smile was small, crooked, halfway between skeptical and fond. "Just stories, I know, but they're comforting in their own way." Nate wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic of the mug. Steam rose in gentle spirals, fog in miniature. "Handles?" he asked, as casually as he could manage. "You remember any of their CB handles?" She laughed once softly. "My brother went by Beacon on account of the company." Her eyes grew distant for a moment, replaying old sounds. "His friend, always running with him when they could, went by Harlan. Real name was something else, but I barely remember hearing it. To me, he was just Harlan on the wire." Outside, a truck rolled past on the nearby highway, its sound softened by the lingering mist. The river lay somewhere beyond the far line of trees, carrying its own slow story under the fog. Nate lifted the coffee to his lips. The heat of it was grounding, normal. Around him, dishes clinked softly. Someone laughed 2 booths down. A coffee machine hissed in the background. On certain nights, when the fog rolled in thick over the river and the bridge became a narrow path through nothing, a single truck would find itself joined briefly by companions. Voices on the radio, calm and steady. Taillights ahead, headlights behind. Advice about curves that could not be seen but could be felt. Most drivers, once safely over and back on solid ground, would chalk up the oddness of those moments to fatigue, to nerves, to the mind's tendency to embroider in the dark. They would not examine too closely why the voices on the other end of the line used phrases a little out of fashion, or spoke of lane configurations that no longer existed, or knew the bridge's smallest quirks as if it were a living thing. And the fog, patient and slow, would continue to gather on the river, to roll over the bridge, to press soft against concrete and steel. Now and then, it would fold space and time just enough that old runs and new overlapped for a while, and drivers separated by decades could keep one another company for a crossing. In those hours on that span, isolation loosened its grip. The highway, vast and often indifferent, became, for a handful of miles, a shared, suspended world, held in fog and memory, watched over by those who understood better than most the strange comfort of another voice in the dark. Story number 5. The interstate ran arrow straight across the flat country, a pale band of concrete stretching between low horizons where the land and sky met in a soft, indistinct line. Out here, the fields went on for miles, stitched together by drainage ditches and fence posts, interrupted now and then by the suggestion of a distant barn or a cluster of trees huddled around a farmhouse. At night, all of that dissolved into dark silhouettes and memory. Around Rosa, the world felt wrapped in cotton. Ground fog had settled in after midnight, first as a faint haze in the distance, then as a low, creeping layer that hugged the earth and drifted lazily across the highway. It wasn't thick enough to blind, not yet, but it blurred the shoulders and softened the guardrails, turning the road ahead into a narrow, glowing tunnel. Inside the cab, everything was muted and contained. The dash lights glowed in subdued greens and ambers, numbers and needles making their quiet circuits. The clock read 2:23 a.m. The radio was turned low, some late-night station playing old soul songs that slipped around the engine noise and into the corners of the cab. Rosa's thermos sat in the cup holder, its metal sides beaded faintly with condensation. The smell of strong coffee and a hint of vanilla creamer drifted up whenever she lifted the lid. Her rig, a white Kenworth with a sleeper she kept meticulously tidy, hummed along at a steady pace. The engine note was low and contented, a vibration she felt in her feet through the pedals and in the back of her shoulders where the seat supported her. The wheel fit easily in her hands. She had been driving most of her adult life, long enough that the feel of a big truck awake at night had become a kind of second home. Fog liked low places, she knew. It pooled in dips and shallow basins, gathered along river bottoms and the subtle sags in long, flat stretches of ground. Out here, the interstate rode a slight, almost imperceptible roller coaster over the land, barely noticeable in clear weather, more pronounced now that the fog was outlining every gentle hollow. Ahead, a green sign emerged from the murk, Way Station 2 MILES, all trucks. Its reflective surface flashed bright white in her beams, then slipped by. At this hour, she expected the next sign to say closed. Most stations shut down in the dead of night unless there was some special enforcement blitz. Still, she always noted them, an old habit drilled into her from her first days on the road. Way stations, like toll booths and border crossings, marked thresholds. Another half mile, another sign. Fog area, low visibility possible. As if to illustrate the point, the ground fog thickened, rising from ankle height to knee, then higher. It lapped at the underside of the overpasses, rolled across exit ramps, and drifted lazily into the right lane before dispersing under the wake of passing vehicles. Rosa eased off the throttle a fraction, letting her speed settle into something her instincts trusted. The world outside narrowed just a little more, her focus sharpened. Then the next sign appeared, and it gave her a small, quiet start. Way Station 1 mile open. The words shone in glowing green letters on a separate, illuminated panel beneath the reflective board. Even through the fog, the light was unmistakable. She frowned slightly, more in curiosity than annoyance. The app on her phone that pinged active way stations hadn't flagged this one. Maybe the data was out of date, or maybe they'd opened late for some reason. The rules were the rules. An open station meant she'd be peeling off the interstate in a mile, like it or not. Her CB was on, volume turned down low to avoid the static crackle that fog sometimes intensified. She reached up and nudged it a notch higher, just in case anyone ahead of her felt like talking the station through. Channel 19 was mostly quiet. A couple of distant voices faded in and out, discussing weather 2 states away. No one nearby mentioned mile markers or scale houses. The blue outline of a small building began to materialize in the distance as she crested a minor rise, a faint, boxy shadow against the gray. Ground-level lights glowed in a muted line, their beams caught and diffused by the fog until each pool of illumination looked like a small, pale island floating in milk. As she drew closer, the familiar sequence of signage marched along the right side of the road. Way station 12 mile, prepare to stop. Then lane closed, all trucks right lane. An aero board pulsed amber, its chevrons pushing her gently toward the exit. She flicked on her right blinker. The soft tick-tick filled the cab, a counterpoint to the hum of the tires and the low murmur of the radio. The ramp curved off the main line in a broad, easy arc, descending into thicker fog that seemed to rest in the shallow bowl where the way station had been built. The air felt different here, cooler by a degree or two, denser, carrying the faint smells of wet concrete, diesel exhaust, and old, baked asphalt now chilled by night. The lights under the station canopy glowed a warm, sodium vapor orange, halos bleeding into the fog and giving everything a slightly sepia tone. Rosa rolled up to the stop line where a sign instructed all trucks to wait until called. The indicator over the first scale lane was dark. The one over the second showed a steady green arrow. Above the canopy, a rectangular sign edged in light declared, simply, open. She pulled forward when the small, square light above lane 2 clicked over to proceed. The station looked older than most she'd seen recently. Not rundown, exactly. Just built in a style that had gone out of favor. Squarer lines, thicker glass, a low, flat roof with a broad metal awning extending over the truck lanes. A narrow band of fluorescent tubes ran along the awning's underside, their soft, buzzing hum audible through the cracked-open side window. The scale itself was a long, metal plate set into the concrete, its edges painted yellow. As her front axle eased onto it, she felt the faintest change in the truck's vibration, a subtle echo through the floor as the weight registered. She stopped when the painted line on the pavement lined up beneath her mirrors, trailer straight behind. To her left, behind a wide, angled window, sat the scale house. The lights inside were on but turned low, the kind of dimness that suggested a late shift, when bright bulbs were more punishment than help. A desk lamp cast a warm circle on a cluttered countertop, illuminating stacks of paper, an old computer monitor, and beside it, a coffee mug resting on a paper napkin. A man sat behind the glass. He was older, somewhere in his late 60s by the look of him, with hair more silver than dark that had been combed back neatly. He wore a navy work shirt under a high-visibility vest whose reflective stripes had a slightly different pattern than the newer vests Rosa was used to seeing. A name patch was sewn over his pocket, but from her angle and the murky light, she could only make out the first 2 letters, Low. He looked up from a clipboard as her truck settled onto the scale, his gaze finding her cab with the easy accuracy of someone who had done this for decades. His eyes were a clear, steady gray. There was something about the set of his jaw, the line of his shoulders, that reminded her faintly of photographs of older relatives, men who had spent their lives around machines and open air. The intercom speaker by her door crackled to life with a soft pop. She rolled her window down a bit more, letting in the cool, damp air and the faint scent of coffee. "Evenin', driver," came the man's voice, slightly tinny through the speaker but warm beneath the distortion. "How are we doing tonight?" "Evenin'," Rosa replied, leaning slightly toward the window. "Foggy but manageable." "Ain't it just," he said, a small smile touching the corners of his mouth. "You heading eastbound or west?" "East," she said, "out of Carthage, taking it through to the ridge." "Ah," his gaze drifted briefly to a monitor she couldn't see. "Long pull this late." He tapped a pen against the clipboard once, a faint, hollow sound that made it through the glass and into her cab. "You've been on since, what, about 7 hours now?" Rosa blinked. She hadn't said when she'd started. The details were in her log, of course, accessible through the telemetry and the truck's ELD. Newer systems fed that information instantly to stations. But something about the scale house, its analog look, its older fixtures, didn't quite mesh with her expectation of digital integration. She reminded herself that appearances could be deceiving. Old buildings sometimes hid new tech. She nodded. Around that. He peered at another screen, then out at her again. "Truck and trailer looking good. Pretty rig." His eyes flicked to the side of her cab, where her name and company details were stenciled in clean, white letters. "Ms. Vega, you're showing a hair light for your manifest. You sure you've got everything you're supposed to be carrying?" She felt a brief prickle in her chest. "Manifest says 78,800, she said. "Was on the mark at the terminal, sealed." He nodded, eyes dropping to the scale readout just out of her sightline. His brows pinched together faintly. Well, that's what they put on paper. That's one kind of weight." He paused, then looked directly at her again, expression softening. "Scales say you're lighter than that tonight." She frowned. "Lighter. Always good to be lighter than expected," he said easily, as if changing the subject. "Means you're not carrying more than you can handle." He set the clipboard down, leaned forward slightly. "How have you been finding the fog out there, Miss Vega? Treating you kind?" She almost laughed. The question sounded like something her father might have asked, half joking before handing over car keys years ago. "It's thick in the low spots," she said. "Not the worst I've seen, but enough to keep you on your toes." He nodded, the movement slow, considering. "Fog'll tell you a lot about yourself," he said. "Some folks it makes reckless, some careful, some it convinces to stop and take a breath." His gaze tilted past her to the darkness beyond the station. "You got that ridge coming up, should be clear higher up, but the stretch just before it, mile 212 to 219, fog likes to sit in there. Deer do too." The numbers landed in her mind with the weight of recognition. That stretch of road had a reputation. Low-lying, lined with trees, a place where, in certain weather, visibility could vanish in the space of a heartbeat. "My father," the thought surfaced unbidden, as clearly as if someone had spoken the name aloud. Her hands tightened just a fraction on the wheel. Her father had been a driver, too. His last run had ended on a fogged-in section of highway, not unlike this one. She rarely let the memories surface while she was behind the wheel. They carried their own dangerous gravity. The man behind the glass watched her with a quiet, unpressing attention, as if he could see memories arranging themselves in her face. "Road keeps a ledger," he said softly. "Gives and takes in ways that don't always make sense in the moment." The intercom crackled, then steadied. He straightened a bit, glancing once more at his screen, then back at her. "You're all set, Miss Vega," he said. "Scaled and cleared. You can roll when you're ready." A small smile touched his mouth again, but there was something like a shadow in it, a depth that made it more than mere politeness. "You might consider catching 10, 15 minutes at the rest area just before the ridge. Stretch your legs, let the mind loosen up. Fog's always a little trickier when you've got old thoughts rattling around in there with it." She swallowed. "There a rest area before the ridge?" she asked. "Didn't see one marked on my atlas." "It's not big," he said. "Couple of slots, little loop off the right. Hard to spot unless you know to look." His gaze met hers through the glass, steady and kind. "You'll see the sign if you're looking for it. Just a blue board with a bench on it. No name." For a heartbeat, the station seemed to hold its breath. The hum of the fluorescent lights under the awning, the soft patter of moisture dripping from the roof onto concrete, the faint rattle of some unseen fan, they all blended into a kind of low, enveloping hush. Rosa nodded, more to herself than to him. "Maybe I will," she said. "Safe travels, then," he replied. "Watch the low spots." The indicator above her lane clicked from stop to okay with a little mechanical thunk. The scale beneath her tires felt suddenly more like any other piece of road. She eased her rig forward, careful and smooth. As she passed by the window, the man inside lifted his coffee mug a fraction in a small, almost ceremonial gesture. Up close, through the oblique angle of glass and light, she could see his name patch more clearly, the black stitching on white read LOUIE. Then she was out from under the awning, the fog swallowing the scale house in soft layers. The ramp rejoined the interstate, its merged lane disappearing into gray. As she brought the truck up to speed, the glow of the way station's lights faded behind her, subsumed by the broader, darker night. She checked her mirrors. In the red-tinged reflection of her taillights, the station looked diminished, smaller. The open sign was still visible, a pale rectangle in the fog. Then a slight dip in the land, a turn of the road, and it was gone. The CB, quiet since the scale, gave a short, almost apologetic burst of static. She eyed it, then reached up and thumbed the mic. "Breaker, anyone run that way station back at 188 tonight?" she asked. "Looked different than I remembered." Nothing answered but the soft hiss of signal noise, and far off, the faint, overlapping ghosts of conversations too distant to parse. She flipped channels, checked for local chatter. A weather alert scrolled past across the tiny digital readout, dense fog advisory until sunrise. No mention of stations, open or closed. Miles slipped by, measured in the slow, steady rhythm of white dashes and green signs. The fog thickened again in predictable hollows, thinned over subtle rises. The land began to change, almost imperceptibly at first, gaining the kind of gentle undulations that hinted at higher ground ahead. Tree lines grew denser along the shoulders. The air through her cracked window took on a faint, resinous scent. She watched the blue service signs as they came and went, more out of curiosity now than need. Gas, 24 hours. Food, exit 194. Lodging. Then some minutes later, a smaller blue rectangle emerged, partly shrouded by fog. It bore a simple image, the outline of a bench beneath a tree. No text, no arrows, just the universal symbol for a rest area. No mile number on the bottom. No next area XXMILES. Rosa felt a small, quiet shiver of recognition that was not quite déjà vu, not quite surprise. She hadn't seen this symbol listed on her route app. It didn't appear on the printed atlas folded in the pocket beside her seat. But there it was, painted plain and blue against the night. The exit for it was unassuming, a narrow lane peeling off to the right, unlit beyond the initial reflective sign. No towering lamps, no sculpted concrete approaching, just a darker gap in the guardrail and the promise of a small loop beyond. She could have driven past. Her hours were still in good shape, and the idea of getting the ridge behind her before any surprise fog bank rolled over it was tempting. The truck felt solid beneath her, and the road ahead lay quiet and waiting. But the memory of the scale house lingered, of Louis's steady gaze and the way he had spoken about fog and old thoughts. The suggestion he had offered, not a command, never that, just a gentle nudge toward a choice. Her hand moved almost of its own accord, guiding the wheel toward the right. The blinker's rhythmic tick filled the cab once more. She eased off the throttle, let the truck drift into the exit lane. The rest area was small, just as he had said. A short loop of pavement, a pair of angled parking spots sized for trucks, a few more for cars. A single low building, maybe just restrooms, sat under a stand of tall, dark trees whose branches wove together above it, dripping with beaded moisture. There were no towering lights, just a couple of modest fixtures mounted on short poles, their glow soft and golden, swallowed quickly by the fog. The lot itself lay mostly in shadow, dim outlines of picnic tables and trash cans emerging where the pale light reached. No other vehicles occupied the spaces. The place felt untouched, like a room waiting for the first guest of the night. Rosa rolled into one of the truck bays and set her brake. As the engine wound down to idling, then to silence when she cut it, a pleasant, enveloping quiet settled around her. She could hear the faint patter of droplets sliding from tree leaves to roof, the distant, softened whoosh of the interstate just beyond the tree line, the subtle ticking of cooling metal in her own machine. She stepped down from the cab, boots finding damp pavement. The fog here was thinner, more like a fine mist hanging in the air. It clung to her hair, beaded on her jacket. The darkness between the trees felt deep but not hostile, more like a curtain drawn around a temporary, protected pocket. She walked a short circuit of the loop, stretching her arms overhead, feeling the vertebrae in her back align with small, satisfying pops. The night was cool but not frigid, the moisture lending it a softness. Somewhere in the branches above, a small bird made a questioning sound, then went quiet again. The building's restrooms were clean, simple, and empty. The fluorescent light inside buzzed faintly. Someone had placed a small plastic vase with a spray of artificial flowers on the sink counter, their colors dulled by age but still stubbornly pink and yellow. 10-15 minutes passed in small, ordinary movements, walking, breathing, sipping the last of her coffee while leaning against the side of the trailer, watching the fog drift between the trunks of the trees. When she climbed back into the cab, her body felt looser, her mind clearer. The ridge run that followed was uneventful. The fog thinned as she gained elevation, turning into low tatters that drifted lazily across the higher ground. The predicted deer never materialized. The miles unspooled smoothly under her, and dawn began to pale the eastern sky just as she rolled into the truck stop where she'd planned to take her longer break. Later that morning, seated in the diner attached to the fuel island, Rosa found herself sharing a table with another driver while they waited for their food. He was in his 50s, ball cap pulled low, the logo of a local carrier on his jacket. They talked, as drivers often did, about routes and weather and the small oddities of the night. Fog was heavy back on 19, she said, stirring sugar into her second cup of coffee. Way Station was open at 188, caught me by surprise. The man looked up at her, spoon halfway to his mouth. "You sure about that mile marker?" he asked. "Pretty sure," she said. "Flat stretch just before the land starts to climb, older-looking station. Guy named Louis running the scale." The man's brows knit together, then lifted in something like bemused disbelief. "That station, been closed for years," he said. "They put in the weigh-in motion sensors on the main line. Old building got torn down when they widened the shoulders. You probably saw the ghost of the exit. There's nothing there now but a concrete pad and some weeds." Rosa took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth fill the space behind her ribs. "I rolled over a scale," she said mildly. "Saw the building, lights on, talked to the man inside." She let a small, wry smile curve her mouth. "Maybe I was more tired than I thought." The driver shrugged, half conceding the point, half intrigued. "Hun, strange things in the fog," he said. "Back when my old man was driving, he used to talk about scale houses popping on and off like porch lights. They're one night, gone the next. He always said there was a guy out here named Louis who took his job so serious he never really left." Behind the counter, near the coffee pots, a small corkboard held faded photographs pinned up under curling pieces of tape. Old trucks, proud drivers, snapshots of the same diner in earlier decades. One photo caught Rosa's eye, a group of men standing in front of a low brick building with a metal awning. "Way Station District 4, read the sign above their heads. She rose, coffee mug cradled in her hand, and moved closer. The men were dressed in high-visibility vests and uniforms that looked slightly dated. At the center of the group stood a familiar figure, silver hair combed back, steady eyes, faint smile. His name patch was clearer in the photo than it had been through the glass, Louiem, Inspector. Someone had written on the white border in blue ink, "Louis' retirement last day, June 2009. The world outside the diner windows was bright now, the fog burned away by a rising sun. Trucks came and went at the pumps, lights off, chrome catching stray glints. The highway in the middle distance looked ordinary again, a ribbon of concrete under a wide, open sky. On nights when the fog pooled thick in the low stretches, drivers still saw signs for way stations that, on paper, no longer existed. They still rolled, by habit or by some quiet nudge, into lanes lit by old sodium lamps, over scales that hummed gently beneath them. They spoke with inspectors whose names had long since been moved to different kinds of ledgers. Maybe it was memory, replaying itself in the minds of tired people at the edge of their limits. Maybe it was something else, something about the way places held onto impressions, like fingerprints pressed into cooling concrete. Maybe roads needed guardians, and some never stopped keeping watch. Whatever the cause, in the deepest hour of fog on the flattest stretch of night, a driver might find a small station open when logic said it should be dark. And there, an older man with steady eyes and a name patch worn by many washings might lean forward, study more than just gross vehicle weight, and suggest, gently, that a person ease off, take a breath, look for a small, unremarkable rest area sign before the ridge. Then the fog would lift, and the maps would agree again, and on clear days the mile markers would tell a simpler story. But in the quiet spaces between, the scales would keep humming, and the road would keep its subtler, stranger ways of balancing what people carried with what they could bear. Story number 6. Past midnight, the road across the low hills felt like a line drawn through a dream. It rose and fell in slow, generous curves, skirting patches of woodland and long, shallow valleys where water gathered in winter. Tonight, a thick, silvery fog lay along those bottoms, climbing the slopes in soft sheets until only the high crowns of the hills stood clearly above it. Jonah's truck floated through that landscape like a quiet ship. Inside the cab, everything was familiar, contained, gently lit. The dash glowed with a constellation of soft greens and ambers. Indicators pulsed with slow reassurance, oil pressure steady, coolant where it should be, fuel riding just above a quarter tank. A digital clock in the upper left corner read 1:57 a.m. He sat comfortably in the worn groove of the driver's seat, shoulders relaxed beneath a flannel shirt, one hand resting light at the bottom of the wheel, the other loose on his thigh. The hum of the engine settled around him, low and steady, a sound he trusted the way other people trusted the ticking of a clock on a bedside table. The air smelled faintly of coffee, heater dust, and clean fabric softener from the zipped bag of spare clothes in the sleeper. Outside, the fog had grown denser as the miles slipped by. At first, it had only softened the shoulders, clinging to the ditches. Now it had risen to almost hood height, pouring across the road in slow, languid waves that turned his headlights into pale, glowing tunnels. The world beyond that narrow cone of visibility felt distant and theoretical. The sky, where it could be seen at all, was a flat, dull gray, the stars completely erased. He knew from past runs that somewhere to his right, beyond the blurred suggestion of tree lines, a wide river meandered quietly through its bed. Somewhere to his left, open pasture rolled away into darkness. Tonight, he couldn't see any of it. All of it might have been the painted scenery behind a stage, taken down and replaced with this uniform wall of softly moving white. On the radio, a late-night station played quietly. Some low, mellow jazz track threaded in and out of the engine noise, the saxophone's notes bending like the road ahead. Now and then, between songs, a disembodied voice announced weather updates for towns he would pass hours from now, places that seemed as abstract in the dark as names from old stories. He took a sip from his insulated mug. The coffee had cooled to drinkable warmth, its bitterness rounded out by the slightest trace of sugar. It woke his tongue and throat without jolting his nerves. He liked it that way. Enough stimulation to stay sharp, not so much that the mind started inventing shapes in shadows. A blue service sign emerged gradually from the fog on the right, its reflective face blooming bright in his beams. Fuel, food, lodging, 5 miles. Listed beneath were a few familiar logos, small icons promising hot showers and bright aisles of snacks. He knew that plaza. He had planned to stop there, refill, and catch a few hours of sleep in a back corner of the lot. He flicked his eyes to the fuel gauge again. Still fine. 20 more miles wouldn't hurt, but the idea of wrapping the night sooner rather than later appealed. Fog driving always asked a little extra of the mind, more focus, more patience. It wore, gently but steadily. The next sign slid into view, half hidden by another fold of fog. Low visibility area next 10 miles. Use caution. As if in response, the fog thickened another degree. The light from his headlamps seemed to push back less and less of it, absorbed quickly into the pale mass ahead. The reflectors along the edge of the road brightened, each one a small, intermittent star. The dotted white line between lanes became his truest compass. Then, just at the edge of his lights, another sign appeared, one he did not recognize. It was larger than the typical blue service markers, more square than rectangular. Its reflective surface shone in his beams with a muted teal he hadn't seen before on this route. In crisp white letters it read, Cedar Hollow Plaza, exit 214. Fuel showers all-night diner. A simple arrow pointed straight ahead. Jonah's brows knit a fraction. Cedar Hollow Plaza. The name stirred nothing in his memory. He had been running this highway for years, through clear summer twilights, autumn rains, winter ice. He knew every truck stop and service station between the state line and the mountains almost by feel. There was no Cedar Hollow on his mental map. He flicked a glance at the GPS mounted low on the dash. The digital line of the interstate led clean and uninterrupted across a featureless patch of map. No exit icon, no services, just the mile number ticking upward in the corner, 212.7, 212.8. The blue sign insisted otherwise. Fog could play tricks with distance. Maybe he had misread the number. Maybe it was a smaller plaza new. Not yet updated in his unit's memory. He let the thought settle and drift. Another mile slid beneath his tires. The jazz on the radio faded, replaced by the soft static of a signal losing its grip on the air. He scanned the darkness ahead, watching for the familiar federal mile marker on the right shoulder. It came, a small, upright rectangle, white numbers on green, 213. Almost immediately after, another sign emerged, closer this time, as if stepping toward him from the fog. Cedar Hollow Plaza, 1 mile. Next full SERVICS, 64 miles. That last number landed with a quiet weight. 64 miles was more than an hour in this fog, more if conditions worsened. His fuel could handle it. His body probably could, too. But tension crept in along the edges of his shoulders, a sense of stretching himself just a little thinner than he liked on a night where the horizon had been taken away. The thought of a diner, warm and humming with low conversation, of fluorescent light spilling over chrome napkin holders and coffee poured from heavy glass pots, took on the glow of minor salvation. His right hand moved almost absently to the CB, thumb brushing the volume knob. The speaker hissed to life, softer than he expected, as if the fog outside had muffled even radio waves. A few distant voices crackled in and out, none near enough to feel companionable. He thumbed the mic anyway. Breaker 19, anyone up near 214 eastbound? You seeing a Cedar Hollow Plaza sign out there, or am I reading my eyes wrong in this fog? Silence answered at first, then a faint scratchy voice bled in, half swallowed by static. Cedar Hollow's real enough, it said. The tone was light, but the words carried an odd gravity. If you're tired and the fog's hungry, she'll show herself. The voice dissolved into noise as quickly as it had appeared. Jonah frowned gently, lifted the mic again. Come back, didn't catch your handle, friend. Only the soft, even hiss of empty channel returned. He set the mic back in its cradle, watching the road. The exit announced itself not with towering lights or a blaze of signage, but in a more subdued fashion. The reflective overhead sign appeared out of the fog. Exit 214, Cedar Hollow RD, SCRVICES. The word SCRVICES glowed faintly beneath, lit from within by small, old-fashioned bulbs rather than the harsher LEDs he was used to seeing now. The ramp slid away to the right, its white lines curving into an arc that disappeared almost immediately into the mist. No tall light poles marked its length. No billboard faces loomed from the edges, selling food or fuel. It looked, for all the world, like any small rural exit. He could have stayed on the main line. He thought briefly and clearly about doing just that. Pushing on to the plaza he knew, the one printed on his app, the one he could see in his mind as clearly as if he were already there. His fingers tapped light on the wheel. Then, with a softness that surprised him, he clicked the turn signal down and took the exit. The ramp dipped below the level of the highway, and the fog grew thicker still, swirling low and luminous around the guardrails. Moisture gathered on the windshield in fine droplets. The sound of his tires changed, the smooth hum of interstate concrete giving way to the more varied, whispering texture of local asphalt. He eased his speed down, following the curve until the ramp flattened out and straightened. Ahead, through the veil, a faint, warm glow began to grow. Cedar Hollow Plaza unrolled itself from the fog in stages. First came the tall sign, rising up on a single pole at the edge of the short access road, a rectangular board with stylized script and a simple logo, a cedar tree silhouetted against a crescent moon. The colors were slightly faded, as if they had spent years in sun and rain. Beneath the name, smaller panels promised Diesel Shower's 24HR Diner. As he drew closer, the rest of the plaza came into view, a broad asphalt lot, its edges softened by the moisture in the air, lined with the pale shapes of parked rigs. They sat under a scattering of lamps mounted on moderate-height poles, each lamp casting a pool of yellowish light rather than the harsher white he was accustomed to. The fog danced through those cones, turning them into glowing columns. At the far side of the lot, a low, sprawling building extended, a truck stop in the classic style. The storefront windows glowed warmly. Neon tubing traced the roofline in a soft, humming outline. The words All Night Diner burned in red and blue above a set of glass doors, letters buzzing faintly. He rolled his rig slowly into one of the marked truck bays along the outer edge of the lot. The painted lines were slightly worn but neat. A few other trucks were scattered here and there, shapes resolving into detail as he passed. An older cabover with a company name he hadn't seen in years, a long-nosed rig with rounded fenders, and a faded mural on its sleeper, a tanker with a logo from a fuel brand that had been bought out before he'd ever earned his CDL. The strange familiarity of those details brushed against him, then retreated. He put the thoughts aside, set his brake, and let the engine idle for a moment before turning the key. The vibrations faded, leaving the night's other sounds to fill in. The hum of the nearby lamps, the distant, low rush of the interstate beyond the hill, the soft hiss of fog pressing gently against everything. He stepped down from the cab. The air met him cool and damp, beating instantly on his beard and the exposed skin of his neck. The world smelled of wet pavement, diesel, and the comforting, greasy warmth of frying food drifting faintly across the lot. He took a moment just to breathe it in. Then he walked toward the building, boots making muted thuds on the dark, slightly shining asphalt. Inside, the diner felt like stepping into a pocket of another time. The first impression was one of warmth, not just temperature, though the air was cozy after the damp outside, but color. The overhead lights were a soft, creamy yellow. The vinyl booths along the walls were upholstered in shades of deep red and muted teal. Chrome edged the tables and counter, dulled slightly at the corners by many years of elbows and plates. A long counter ran along the left side, lined with round stools topped in cracked vinyl. Behind it, a grill hissed gently, steam rising from a flat top where someone was tending eggs and pancakes. A row of heavy glass coffee pots sat on warmers, dark liquid catching the light in slow, syrupy glints. Music drifted from small speakers mounted high in the corners, something mellow and old but not old enough to be antique. A soft electric piano, a smooth voice singing a ballad from maybe 20 years back. A television mounted above the far end of the counter showed a muted news channel, the graphics on the screen just slightly out of date in style. The air smelled of coffee, frying onions, bacon, pancakes, and the comforting, indefinable scent of a place that had fed many people for many nights. A few patrons occupied the space. A man in a denim jacket and ball cap sat at the counter, hands wrapped around a mug, his attention on a notebook he was actively not writing in. A woman with short, curled hair and a reflective vest draped over the back of her booth stirred sugar into her drink, staring absently at the window where only a sheet of white fog looked back. In a corner, a pair of drivers in company polos Jonah didn't recognize leaned over a table, talking quietly. He took a seat at the counter, 3 stools in from the door. The vinyl creaked gently beneath him. A laminated menu with softened corners and a few coffee stains slid into the space before him, as if moved there by muscle memory. "Even in," said the waitress, appearing behind the counter with a coffee pot in one hand and a pencil stuck behind her ear. She had a kind, lined face and salt and pepper hair pulled back into a loose bun. Her name tag read Marlene. "Fog gettin' to you out there." He smiled, the expression coming easier than he would have expected after so many hours on the road. "Thick as soup," he said. "Figured I'd pull off before I started seeing things that weren't there." She tilted the pot. "Coffee, please." The mug that appeared in front of him was heavy, white ceramic, the kind that could survive being dropped more than once. The coffee that filled it was dark, steaming, carrying that rich, slightly burnt smell that seemed like a requirement in places like this. "Kitchen, still doing the full menu," Marlene said. "But if you're looking for something to hold you through the rest of the night, the number 5 plate is popular. Eggs, hash, toast, couple strips of bacon. Pancakes if you ask nicely." He glanced over the menu, noted prices that felt low somehow, even adjusting for the kind of rural highway stop this was. Then again, he'd been on the road a long time. Maybe his memory was skewed. "Number 5 sounds good," he said. "Pancakes too, since you offered." She grinned faintly, scribbled on her pad, "You got it." As she moved away, he let his eyes roam the diner more fully. There was something about the way the people here occupied the space that felt distinct. No one seemed in a rush. No one was glued to a glowing screen. A man at a nearby booth was leafing through a paper road atlas, its pages worn and creased. The woman in the reflective vest had what looked like an actual paperback novel open in front of her. Snatches of conversation drifted past. "Fog rolled in hard over Clark's Hollow, had us crawling." "Trucker's lot was full up in '98. If you can believe it, we ended up down at Miller's Field. You take the old 2-lane before they straightened it. Used to be a killer in winters." The details pricked at him. Names of places he hadn't heard in years. References to road configurations that had been changed out long ago. It was like listening to people discuss an older version of the world's map. At the far end of the counter, the television flashed images of a storm in some other part of the country. The lower third graphics fonts and layout looked oddly dated, sharper edges, less sleek design. The anchor's hair and suit cut said a decade he couldn't quite pin, something adjacent but not identical to now. He took a sip of coffee, letting the bitter warmth settle him. The fog outside pressed softly against the diner windows, erasing everything beyond arm's length. The glass was speckled with tiny droplets that caught the inside light, turning the fog into an almost solid, glowing wall. "First time at Cedar Hollow?" the man with the notebook asked suddenly, not looking up from the blank page in front of him. Jonah turned his head slightly. "Yeah," he said, "didn't even know it was here." The man huffed a small breath that might have been a laugh. "Most don't," he said. His eyes, when he lifted them, were pale blue and tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. "Plaza's shy. Shows up when roads are longer than they ought to be." The words were said lightly, like a joke, but something in the cadence hooked into the part of Jonah's brain that had been quietly cataloging oddities since he took the exit. "Been running this stretch for years," Jonah said. "Never seen a sign for it before tonight." "Fog changes the map sometimes," the man replied. He tapped his notebook once. The pages were entirely blank, or lets old roots bleed through. His mouth curved in a half smile. "Depends who you ask." A plate arrived in front of Jonah, set down with practiced grace. Eggs just the way he liked them, hash browns crisp at the edges, bacon curling invitingly, toast buttered to glistening. A separate plate with 2 golden pancakes landed beside it, a small metal pitcher of syrup catching the light. The food smelled exactly like comfort should at 2 in the morning. Simple, hearty, warm. He ate slowly. Conversation ebbed and flowed around him. A trucker in the corner talked about a near miss with a fog bank that had appeared out of nowhere on a mountain pass 15 years ago. Another mentioned a rest area that sometimes turned up on his GPS in one county, vanished in another. As he listened, a thought crept into his mind unbidden, that everyone in the room was speaking from a slightly different angle in time. Their details overlapped but didn't quite align. Road names he associated with old maps, companies that had been merged or gone under, weather events long past. It was as if Cedar Hollow Plaza sat at a junction where the long river of highway nights curved close to itself, and travelers from different segments could share coffee for a while. The idea should have unsettled him. Instead, it settled in with a strange, quiet rightness. After all, the road was one of the few things that truly connected years. Lines painted decades ago still guided tires tonight. Signs put up in one generation still threw light on the next. People changed, trucks changed, but the feeling of being awake on a foggy interstate at 2 a.m. had probably not shifted much in half a century. Places like this held that feeling. When he finished his plate, sopping up the last of the egg yolk with a corner of toast, Marlene appeared again to refill his coffee. "You look better than when you walked in," she observed, eyes crinkling at the corners. "Road put some color back in your face." "Diner did," he said. "Thank you." She shrugged as if to dismiss the compliment, but the pleased flicker in her expression betrayed her. "Fog's easing a little," she said. "If you're headed for the ridge, you'll hit clearer air up top. Watch the dip at 221. It likes to keep a little extra mist for itself." He nodded, the mile marker clicking into place in his mind. "I will." When the check came, the total was almost laughably small. He paid in cash from the fold in his wallet. The bills looked perfectly normal in his hand, but as he slid them across the counter, he wondered, just faintly, whose pocket they might end up in next. What year that person would think it was. He stepped back out into the night. The fog had thinned slightly around the plaza, as Marlene had said. The glow from the building's windows spilled farther into the lot, illuminating the outlines of the parked trucks more clearly. He recognized models now, a cab-over design he hadn't seen in service in years. A tanker from an old regional brand his first trainer used to curse or praise, depending on the day. As he walked back to his own rig, a shape beyond the rows caught his eye. Parked a few spaces down, partially veiled by a weak pool of light, sat a truck that looked startlingly like his own, but not quite. Same manufacturer, similar wheelbase, same sleeper shape, but the paint was a shade darker. The company logo along the side, in ghostly hand-painted script, bore the name his father had driven under, years before that fleet folded. A faded decal in the back window of the cab matched one his father had carried, a small mountain silhouette with a rising sun. Jonah stood still for a long breath. He took in the details. The way the hood sat just a fraction differently, the older style of the mirrors, the license plate format from a previous decade. Light from the diner brushed the chrome, softening all the edges. The cab was dark inside. No silhouette moved behind the glass. The truck rested like any other, massive, still asleep. He knew, rationally, that it was impossible. That particular rig had been retired long before he ever got his hands on a steering wheel. But the ache in his chest at the sight of it wasn't fear. It was something more like homesickness for a place he'd never been, and a time he'd only heard about in stories traded across tables just like the one he'd left. He lifted a hand, almost without thinking, in a small, informal salute. Then he turned, climbed into his own truck and shut the door with the soft, sealing thud that made the cab once again its own small world. The engine came to life with a familiar rumble, Gauges rose. Lights glowed. He sat for a moment, hands resting on the wheel, listening to the comforting machinery sounds around him. In his mirror, Cedar Hollow Plaza receded as he eased out of the lot. The tall sign with its cedar tree and crescent moon glowed softly at the edge of the fog. The building windows shone warmly. The neon diner letters buzzed their quiet declaration into the night. He followed the access road back up to the highway. The merge lane unfolded ahead, its edges marked by reflective posts and faintly shining paint. The fog thickened briefly as he climbed, then thinned again as he reached the higher stretch of the interstate. When he checked his GPS, the screen showed him back on the main line, the again familiar truck stop icon still 60-odd miles ahead. The place he had originally aimed for. No exit at 214 was marked. The map showed only a narrow, unnamed road crossing beneath the highway there, its junctions noted but uncelebrated. He drove on. The fog in the valleys did, as promised, cling to certain dips, but never reached the density it had before. He navigated the hollow near 221 with a calm he might not have had an hour earlier, attention steady, muscles loose. The ridge rose before him, its higher altitude catching cleaner air. By the time the sky began to pale at the eastern rim, the ground mist lay only in low, wispy streaks along distant fields. He reached his planned truck stop just as dawn softened the edges of the world. Its lights were bright and modern. Its aisles inside were filled with the gleam of new packaging, updated logos, promotional screens. The coffee was hotter and more bitter. The prices matched his expectations. It was all solidly, reassuringly contemporary. While waiting in line, he overheard two drivers talking about the night. Fog was something else on the low stretch, one said. Thought about pulling off, but there ain't much between 190 and here. Old-timers used to talk about some plaza down that way, the other replied. Cedar Hollow or something. That place burned down back in the 90s, far as I know, or got closed when the new bypass went in. Hard to separate the fact from the tall tailies. Jonah glanced at the small receipts pinned behind the counter with thumbtacks, old promotions, faded flyers. Among them, near the bottom, was a yellowing business card held in place by a rusted staple. Cedar Hollow Plaza, it read in modest script, a phone number that no longer matched any current area code. Beneath, in smaller print, if you're driving through the fog, drop in and rest your eyes. He took his coffee back to the truck and sat with the engine off for a moment, watching the daylight gather over the parking lot. The fog was retreating now to the lowest gullies, its parting slow and reluctant. Trucks came and went, metal gleaming in the new sun. Out on the highway, there would be nights to come when the fog pressed in thick again, erasing horizons and bending sound. On some of those nights, a driver might see a teal-blue sign where no sign usually stood, promising an all-night diner and fuel and showers at an unfamiliar plaza. They might follow it, half from need, half from curiosity. They would find, perhaps, a pool of warm light in the middle of the white, old rigs and newer ones sharing the same patch of cracked asphalt, stories from different years moving across the same worn counter, a waitress who knew where the fog liked to cling and where the road opened up again. Then dawn would come, and the maps would show only the exits everyone knew. The mile markers would tick by in simple, linear order. Cedar Hollow Plaza would go back to whatever fold in the fog it lived in when the sky was clear. But in the small, indeterminate hours, when the road felt longer than it should and a driver's mind tugged backward and forward at once, toward what had been and what might be, the plaza might lay itself out again, a temporary harbor, a place where time thinned enough that those who kept the long watches on the highways could sit down together, share a meal, and remember that even in isolation, they were part of something larger and continuous, stretching across miles and years, lit by the soft, steady glow of way stations that did not quite obey the ordinary rules of maps.